Hello, everyone. It's nice to see you again in the Anunnaki story today. I would like to introduce to you an ancient Anunnaki story that science cannot explain. Now I invite you to listen to this very interesting Anunnaki story. Hey guys, tonight we're journeying back. Way back. Imagine, if you will, a sky choked with stars, so many you feel like you could just reach out and scoop them up like celestial diamonds. Beneath this velvet canopy, the air is warm, thick with the scent of dust, river water, and something ancient, something watching. You're standing on the Fertile Crescent, millennia before your time, and the whispers on the desert wind are starting to sound a lot like forgotten histories. Tonight we're diving so deep into the rabbit hole of the Anunnaki and the alien gods of Nibiru, you might forget which way is up, or if up even exists anymore, especially when we're talking about beings from other planets. You probably won't survive this with all your preconceived notions intact, just a friendly heads up. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Pop your location and local time in the comments below. It's always fascinating to see where our little community of night owls is tuning in from. It's like a global campfire, isn't it? Sharing stories under the digital stars. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a place called Sumer, nestled between the mighty Tigris and Euphrates rivers. It's the cradle of civilization, or so they tell you in the history books. But as you stand here, feeling the grit of the sun-baked earth beneath your feet, you sense it's more than just a cradle. It's a stage. A stage upon which a truly epic drama unfolded, one whose echoes still ripple through our modern world, if you know where to listen. The air hums with an almost electric potential, a feeling that something momentous happened here, something that shaped everything that came after. The year is, well, let's just say it's a long, long time ago. Think around 4500 BCE, give or take a few centuries. It's hot, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer above the reed huts and the nascent ziggurats, those step pyramids always reaching for the heavens. You see people, dark-haired and robed, going about their day. They're inventing things, little things, big things, like writing. The Sumerians are credited with developing one of the earliest known writing systems, cuneiform, etched into wet clay tablets with a reed stylus. Imagine that, the first emails, but way heavier and definitely not fitting in your pocket. Probably a nightmare if you had a typo. Oh, for Enki's sake, I have to re-roll this entire tablet. But it's not just pottery and irrigation ditches they're developing here. It's a complex system of belief. Gods and goddesses walk through their myths with very human-like personalities. They get jealous, they scheme, they fall in love, they throw cosmic tantrums. Hey guys, tonight we're peeling back the very fabric of time, sifting through the sun-baked dust of ancient Mesopotamia. Imagine, if you will, endless reeds swaying in a warm breeze, the scent of damp earth and distant cook fires in the air, and the first cities on Earth just beginning to shimmer on the horizon under a canopy of stars so bright they feel sometimes in fear. Names like Anu, the god of the heavens, Enlil, the god of the air, and storms like pinpricks in the velvet cloak of night. It's here, in this cradle of civilization, that whispers of powerful, enigmatic beings first began to echo down through the ages. Honestly, after this, your neatly ordered view of history, a bit of a grumpy fellow, if we're honest. And Enki, the god of wisdom, magic might just crumble like an old clay tablet. You probably won't look at ancient statues the same way again. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy water, often seen as a bit of a maverick, a friend to humankind. These aren't just quaint fireside tales to them. These are explanations for the world around them. Why does the river flood? Enlil must be displeased. Why is the harvest bountiful? Enki has been generous. But where did these stories, these incredibly do here? I'd love to see where you're all tuning in from, so drop your city and current time in the comments below. It's always amazing to see this global community coming together for a bit of late-night pondering. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on a vast, fertile plain, the air thick with the scent-detailed genealogies of gods come from. The Sumerians themselves claimed they were passed down, knowledge from the gods themselves, of silt and growing things. This is Sumer, the land between the rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, whose they appear almost fully formed in the earliest texts. It's like they didn't gradually evolve these ideas. Waters breathe life into the sun-scorched earth. It's somewhere around 6,000 years ago, a time when the very, but rather they were given them. Historians still argue whether the sudden sophistication of Sumerian culture idea of a city is brand new, a radical experiment in communal living. You see clusters of reed huts at first, then, including their complex pantheon and advanced astronomical knowledge, was a purely indigenous development, or perhaps spurred by contact with a more advanced, unknown civilization. It's a tantalizing question, isn't it? You wander through the bustling city of Uruk. As centuries slip by like grains of sand through your fingers, more permanent structures of sun-dried mud brick begin to rise. Or perhaps Eridu, one of the oldest cities in the world according to Sumerian king lists, a place there the landscape is a patchwork of green fields, canals glinting like silver ribbons under the Mesopotamian sun, and the bustling, burgeoning settlements of Uruk, Uar, and Eridu. These aren't just villages anymore. They are becoming said was founded by the gods. The ziggurat dominates the skyline, a man-made mountain connecting earth to sky, the world's first true cities, complete with temples, marketplaces, and the beginnings of social hierarchy. Imagine trying to explain why. Priests, in elaborate attire, perform rituals you don't quite understand, chanting in a language that sounds both Phi to someone whose biggest tech concern was whether their mud brick was properly dried. Good times. It's here guttural and melodic. They're making offerings, perhaps of beer, because here's a quirky tidbit. In this crucible of innovation, that one of humanity's greatest leaps occurs, the invention of writing. Around 350 Sumerians were master brewers and considered beer a divine gift, essential for religious ceremonies and daily life. They even had a 0 BCE. The Sumerians began to etch pictographs onto wet clay tablets using reed styluses. These weren't love goddess of beer, Ninkasi. So next time you're enjoying a cold one, you can thank the Sumer poems or epic sagas, not at first anyway. Much of the earliest cuneiform writing, as it came to be known, eons for paving the way. Probably less hoppy back then, but who knows? But it's not just beer and bureaucracy. As you delve deeper into the translated texts, into the epics and hymns, you find references to these with surprisingly mundane records of grain, livestock, and beer rations. Yes, beer. Our ancient ancestors knew how to prioritize. But this revolutionary act of recording information, of giving permanence to thought and speech, would change the world forever. It allowed for Anunnaki. The name itself is evocative, those who from heaven to earth came. It's not just a complex administration, the codification of laws, and crucially for our journey tonight, the recording of their beliefs, their myths, and poetic flourish. The texts speak of them descending, of their celestial abodes, of their great power. These aren't nature, their understanding of the cosmos. And what a cosmos it was in their eyes. The Sumerians looked up at the same spirits or abstract concepts. They are described as beings, often of immense stature and dazzling appearance. They wield strange tools, possess stars you see, perhaps even clearer without the haze of modern city lights, and they wove elaborate tales to explain the world, incredible knowledge and demand obedience. You might notice the artwork too. Stylized figures with large, watchful eyes. Around them, their universe was populated by a pantheon of powerful, often capricious deities. At the heart of their conical hats or horn crowns. Sometimes they're depicted with wings or emerging from strange, skyborne craft. Religious life stood the ziggurats, massive step pyramids that dominated the city's skylines, earthly homes for their gods. Is this just artistic license, the product of a fertile imagination? Or are these depictions attempts to record something real? Something connecting the terrestrial realm with the celestial? You can almost feel the collective effort, the sheer manpower and devotion that witnessed. The Sumerians looked to the skies with a knowledge that seems almost uncanny for their time. They mapped constellations, went into raising these colossal structures, brick by painstaking brick, reaching towards the heavens. These weren't distant, aloof, tracked the movements of planets, 5 of which were known to them, which is pretty good going without a high-powered telescope, gods. The Sumerian texts, once deciphered, paint a picture of deities who were intimately involved in human affairs. They had and developed a sophisticated calendar. They spoke of a 12th planet in our solar system, a rogue wanderer whose personalities, rivalries, and, it seems, quite a bit of drama. These weren't your gentle, turn-the-other-cheek deities, more like a cosmic soap opera with sky-high stakes, and the occasional smiting orbit brought it into our vicinity only once every few thousand years. This planet they called Nibiru, the planet. The most prominent among them were beings like Anu, the god of the heavens, Enlil, the god of wind of the crossing. And it was from Nibiru, the stories insist, that the Anunnaki came. Think and storm, a powerful and sometimes wrathful figure, and Enki, the god of wisdom, magic, and the about it. You're a Sumerian farmer. You've just finished your back-breaking work in the fields, trying to coax life from the often unforgiving land. You look up at night, and you see the same subterranean sweet waters. And then there was a collective group, often mentioned with a sense of awe and perhaps a little fear, the Anunnaki. The name itself is evocative, often translated as those who from heaven to earth came, or prank stars we see, but your understanding of them is framed by these incredible stories. Stories of gods who pilot celestial boats, who battle early offspring. As you sift through translations of these ancient texts, you begin to notice something peculiar. The descriptions of these in the heavens who came down and taught your ancestors how to build cities, how to farm, how to live. Anunnaki are often grand, imbued with immense power and a certain otherness. They are described with dazzling brightness. Possessing awesome wouldn't just be myth. It would be your reality, your operating system for understanding the universe. And frankly, who weapons and capable of traversing the skies. While it's easy to dismiss this as poetic hyperbole, the consistency are we, thousands of years later, with our own set of constantly evolving scientific truths, to dismiss their reality so easily and specificity in some accounts give one pause. You see, the Sumerians were meticulous record keepers, practical people who developed. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, if maybe, just maybe, those whispers on the desert wind were mathematics, astronomy, and sophisticated irrigation systems. Their daily lives were deeply intertwined with these divine beings, whom they credited with telling a story far stranger and far more literal than we've ever dared to imagine. The very foundations of the fundamental elements of civilization, agriculture, laws, arts, and crafts. The kings who ruled the Sumerian city ancient society seem to be built upon the premise of these powerful, sky-dwelling beings. Their laws, their social structures, their understanding states were said to be appointed by these gods, acting as their stewards on earth. Sometimes, when you look at the intricate of their place in the cosmos, it all ties back to these figures who they said came from above. Now, how do we even know about Anu's celestial commute, Enlil's stormy moods, or Enki's penchant for hydrological engineering and possibly, just possibly, creating humanity? It's not like they left pamphlets or had a particularly active social media presence back then, though imagine Enlil's posts. Just smote another noisy city. #quiet please, #wrath of God things. No, our knowledge comes from something far more tangible, yet equally remarkable. Hundreds of thousands of clay tablets. Tiny, wedge-shaped marks pressed into damp clay, left to bake in the sun, or sometimes fortuitously preserved when conquering armies burned cities to the ground, inadvertently firing the clay archives into near-indestructible ceramic records. It's a bit like accidentally fireproofing your library by, well, setting it on fire. Not a recommended library management technique, generally speaking. You can picture the scene: Victorian-era archaeologists, bristling with improbable mustaches and a sense of imperial adventure, sweltering under the Mesopotamian sun. Men like Austin Henry Layard at Nineveh, or Paul Emile Botta at Khorsabad. They weren't initially looking for alien gods. They were often searching for biblical connections, for evidence of Old Testament cities and kings. But as they dug, as their local workers carefully brushed away centuries of sand and debris from vast palace complexes and temples, they started finding these tablets. Not just a few, but rooms full of them. The most famous of these discoveries was the Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, unearthed in the mid-19th century, containing over 30,000 cuneiform tablets and fragments. This wasn't just a king's personal Kindle collection. It was a systematic effort to collect all the knowledge of the ancient world, covering everything from royal decrees and epic poems to medical texts, astronomical observations, and crucially for us, detailed accounts of their gods and creation stories. Imagine the sheer excitement, mixed with a healthy dose of bewilderment. Here are these intricate little symbols, clearly a form of writing, but what do they say? For a long time, they were just baffling squiggles. It took brilliant minds, a healthy dose of obsession, and a few key breakthroughs, like the Behistun inscription, a sort of ancient Rosetta Stone for cuneiform, carved into a cliff face in Iran to crack the code. Scholars like Henry Rawlinson, George Smith, and Jules Oppert toiled away, sometimes risking life and limb to copy inscriptions, comparing texts, looking for patterns for known names from other ancient sources. It was like the ultimate Sudoku puzzle, but with the fate of understanding an entire civilization hanging in the balance. And as these ancient codes began to yield their secrets, a world astonishing in its complexity and sophistication emerged. These weren't just primitive grunts and superstitions. The tablets revealed intricate legal systems, predating the Code of Hammurabi in some cases. They showed advanced mathematical understanding, including a sexagesimal base 60 system that, believe it or not, is why we still have 60 seconds in a minute and 360 degrees in a circle. Talk about a lasting legacy. They detailed sophisticated astronomical knowledge, as we touched upon, tracking planetary movements with impressive accuracy. Historians still argue whether the depth of Sumerian astronomical knowledge was purely the result of meticulous, long-term observation, or if it hints at a lost, more advanced source of information. It's a debate that keeps the academic fires burning, sometimes literally if you get two passionate professors in a room with too much coffee. But for our journey tonight, the most electrifying revelations came from the mythological and religious texts. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, with its tales of warring gods and the creation of the cosmos. The Epic of Gilgamesh, with its hero kings searching for immortality, and its astonishingly familiar story of a great flood and a man who builds an ark to survive, a story that predates the biblical Noah by millennia. And within these epics and countless hymns, prayers, and king lists were the Anunnaki, not as vague symbolic figures, but as active participants in Earth's history, interacting with humanity, making decisions that shaped our destiny. The tablets describe their arrival, their establishment of cities, their hierarchy. They list the duties assigned to different gods, their domains, even their family squabbles. It's like reading the minutes from a particularly dramatic celestial board meeting. You learn about Eridu being the first city founded by Enki. You read of the gods needing workers, other debates about how to manage the burgeoning and sometimes troublesome human population. The detail is often mundane enough to feel real. Records of offerings, inventories of divine households, interspersed with these truly mind-boggling narratives of sky gods and cosmic events. Here's a quirky tidbit. Among the thousands of tablets, archaeologists have found some that appear to be student exercises, where apprentice scribes practice their cuneiform by copying famous texts or even writing what seem to be ancient school reports. You can almost imagine a young Sumerian kid groaning as he has to write out, "Enlil is great 50 times with a pointy stick." Some things, it seems, are universal. Or perhaps they were practicing how to record the vital information about celestial flight paths or divine decrees. Memo from Anu. Please ensure all landing zones are clear of sacred cows by next Tuesday. Thanks. The early scholars who deciphered these texts were often stunned by what they found, particularly by the parallels with biblical stories. George Smith, for instance, famously exclaimed with excitement when he first translated the flood narrative from a Gilgamesh tablet, realizing its profound implications for understanding the origins of Old Testament stories. It wasn't always a comfortable discovery for a society deeply rooted in biblical literalism. To find these well-known narratives in an older pagan context was unsettling for some. It opened up a whole new vista on the ancient Near East, suggesting a far more complex tapestry of cultural exchange and mythological borrowing than previously imagined. And so, thanks to these baked clay hard drives and the brilliant patient minds that learned to read them, the stage was set. The cast of characters, Anu, Enlil, Enki, and the collective known as the Anunnaki had been introduced. Their world, their concerns, their alleged interactions with our fledgling species, all lay waiting in those wedge-shaped indentations, a message in a bottle from the dawn of time, just waiting for someone to finally read the label. The sheer volume of these texts, many still untranslated or only partially understood, hints that there may yet be more secrets hidden in plain sight, more pieces of this ancient puzzle waiting to be slotted into place. Now you might be thinking, okay, ancient Sumerians, clay tablets, gods with complicated family lives, interesting, but where does the alien part really kick into high gear? Well, for that, we need to fast forward a few millennia from the dusty digs of Layard and Bada to the latter half of the 20th century and introduce a name that, depending on who you ask, is either synonymous with groundbreaking insight or spectacularly imaginative. Pseudoscience, Zecharias Sitchin. Picture this. It's the 1970s. The world is abuzz with the space race, a growing fascination with UFOs, and a general cultural vibe that's open to, shall we say, alternative interpretations of history. Eric von Daniken's Chariots of the Gods had already planted the seed in the popular imagination that ancient astronauts might have visited Earth. And into this fertile ground stepped Sitchin, an Azerbaijani-born, Russian-American author and researcher, armed with a lifelong fascination with ancient languages and mythologies. He wasn't a professional archaeologist or a university-affiliated cuneiformist in the traditional sense. He was more of an independent scholar, a passionate autodidact who claimed to be able to read Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and other ancient Semitic and Indo-European languages. In 1976, Sitchin published his seminal work, The 12th Planet, the first in his Earth Chronicles series. And it dropped like a cosmic bombshell. Sitchin wasn't just saying the Anunnaki were gods. He was saying they were astronauts. Extraterrestrial beings from a planet in our own solar system, a planet the Sumerians called Nibiru. He proposed that Nibiru, this 12th planet, counting the sun, moon, and the then-known planets, plus Nibiru itself, in a way that some found a bit numerically creative, had a vast elliptical orbit that brought it into the inner solar system roughly every 3,600 years. This, he claimed, was the celestial clock by which Anunnaki activities, and indeed major epochs of human history, were timed. It was a bold, sweeping theory, and it grabbed public attention in a way that dry academic treatises rarely do. Suddenly, those ancient gods weren't just mythological figures. They were flesh and blood, or whatever aliens have, visitors with a very specific agenda. Sitchin's interpretation of the cuneiform texts was, to put it mildly, unconventional. Where mainstream scholars saw poetic metaphors for natural phenomena or struggles between city-states personified as gods, Sitchin saw literal descriptions of advanced technology and space travel. He argued that the Sumerian word Shem, often translated as name or renown, actually meant skychamber or rocket ship. Those winged discs so common in Mesopotamian art, not just symbols of divinity, but actual flying craft. The gods' fiery chariots, space vehicles, their awesome weapons that could level mountains and boil seas, perhaps even atomic devices. Historians still argue whether Sitchin's translations represent a legitimate, overlooked layer of meaning in the Sumerian texts or a radical misinterpretation driven by a preconceived extraterrestrial hypothesis. It's the core of the Sitchin debate. Was he a visionary uncovering a hidden truth, or a master of fitting ancient evidence to a modern alien narrative? He painted a vivid picture. These Anunnaki, facing an atmospheric crisis on their homeworld Nibiru, needed vast quantities of gold. Not for bling, mind you, though some of them did seem to enjoy a bit of divine sparkle, but to create a fine gold dust shield to protect their dwindling atmosphere. Earth, Sitchin proposed, was their target, a planet rich in this precious metal. So they journeyed here, established bases, and set about the arduous task of mining gold. This was their mission Earth. It's a compelling narrative, isn't it? It provides a motive, a purpose for these ancient visitors. It's certainly more dramatic than they came for the excellent Sumerian beer, though knowing the Sumerians, that might have been a secondary objective. Remember Ninkasi, the beer goddess? Maybe she was also the chief Anunnaki bartender on away missions. Sitchin didn't just pull this out of thin air, according to his supporters. He meticulously referenced Sumerian king lists, astronomical tablets, which he called ephemerides, charting planetary positions, and creation myths, weaving them together into a cohesive, if highly speculative, narrative. He pointed to cylinder seals that he claimed depicted the solar system with planets in their correct relative sizes and order, including an unknown planet beyond Pluto, Nibiru. He even suggested that specific Sumerian gods could be directly equated with individual Anunnaki astronauts, Anu as the leader on Nibiru, Enlil as the mission commander on Earth, Enki as the chief scientist and engineer. Here's a quirky tidbit. Sitchin's theories gained such traction that the concept of Nibiru, or Planet X as it's often called in these contexts, has become a staple of doomsday prophecies and internet conspiracy theories, completely detached from Sitchin's original timeline of a 3,600-year orbit and often predicting its imminent disastrous return. It's a classic case of a fringe idea taking on a life of its own, mutating like a B-movie monster with each retelling. Nibiru is coming next Tuesday to steal all our left socks. You know the type. Of course, the mainstream academic world was, and largely remains, deeply skeptical of Sitchin's work. Scholars of Sumerian language and Mesopotamian history pointed out numerous alleged mistranslations, misinterpretations of iconography, and a tendency to see astronauts where the texts simply described gods or kings in elevated, metaphorical language. They argue that Sitchin imposed a modern technological understanding onto ancient myths that were never intended to be read as literal scientific or historical accounts of space travel. It's a well-established mainstream historical fact that the Sumerians, while advanced for their time, did not possess the kind of technology Sitchin attributed to their gods. There are no archaeological discoveries of rocket parts or laser guns in Sumerian ruins. The evidence for flying craft and advanced weaponry rests entirely on Sitchin's unique interpretation of texts and images. Yet, despite the academic critiques, Sitchin's books sold millions of copies and inspired a devoted following. He tapped into a deep-seated human fascination with our origins, with the possibility that we are not alone, and that our ancient past might be far stranger and more exciting than the history books let on. He gave people a framework, a story that seemed to connect the dots between enigmatic ancient texts, unexplained archaeological sites, and the modern UFO phenomenon. Whether you find his theories plausible or preposterous, there's no denying his impact on popular culture and the ancient astronaut discourse. He took those dusty clay tablets and, in the eyes of many, made them launch into space. He gave the Anunnaki their interstellar travel itinerary and their mission statement, effectively becoming Nibiru's most prominent, if controversial, herald in the modern age. So, according to Sitchin's interpretation of those ancient Sumerian whispers and cuneiform etchings, who exactly were these Anunnaki who allegedly commuted from Nibiru? They weren't just a homogeneous blob of aliens. Oh no, the tablets, especially when read through Sitchin's lens, paint a picture of a complex society with a distinct hierarchy, family dramas worthy of a primetime soap opera, and some very powerful personalities at the helm. Think of it as the cosmos turns, broadcast directly from ancient Mesopotamia. At the very top of the Anunnaki pecking order, residing on Nibiru itself, was Anu. His name literally means sky or heaven in Sumerian, which is fitting for the supreme ruler. You can imagine him as the celestial CEO, the big boss, the ultimate authority figure whose decrees were mostly law, even for the Anunnaki contingent dispatched to Earth. He's often depicted as a somewhat remote figure in the Earth-based dramas, but his approval was sought, His decisions carried immense weight, and his lineage was the basis for legitimacy and power among the Anunnaki on our planet. He was the patriarch of this sprawling, powerful, and often fractious divine family. Every now and then, you get the sense he'd look down from Nibiru, see the squabbles his kids were having on Earth, just sigh, "Not this again. Can't I get 5 minutes of cosmic peace?" Now, when the Anunnaki mission to Earth began, Anu didn't lead the away team himself. That crucial, and perhaps rather thankless, task fell to his two most prominent sons, Enlil and Enki. And if ever there were two brothers destined for rivalry, it was these two. Their contrasting personalities and an ongoing power struggle form a central thread in the Anunnaki narrative. Enlil, whose name means Lord of the Command, or Lord of the Air/Storm, was Anu's firstborn son and heir apparent. At least by some accounts, divine succession can be complicated, especially with half-siblings involved. He was appointed as the mission commander on Earth, based in his command center at Nibiru. Enlil comes across as a stern, disciplined, and sometimes harsh leader. He was the enforcer, the one concerned with order, protocol, and the success of the gold mining mission above all else. He wasn't particularly fond of the burgeoning human race, often seeing them as noisy, troublesome, and a distraction from the Anunnaki's primary objectives. If something went wrong, or if humanity got too uppity, Enlil was often the one to suggest a rather direct solution. Like, say, a giant flood. More on that later. He was the cosmic equivalent of that boss who lives by the rulebook and doesn't appreciate unscheduled chit-chat by the water cooler, especially if the water cooler is Earth's entire ocean. Then you have Enki, whose name means Lord of the Earth, or Lord of the Firm Ground/Waters. He was Anu's other prominent son, though his parentage and status relative to Enlil are subjects of much divine genealogical debate in the texts. Some stories suggest he was Anu's firstborn, but not by Anu's official consort Untu, which complicated his claim to the primary succession. Enki was the chief scientist, the chief engineer, the master geneticist, the god of wisdom, magic, and crafts. His primary domain was the Abzu, the deep sweet waters, and his main city was Eridu, which, as we've heard, the Sumerians claimed was the very first city established on Earth, built by Enki himself. Unlike his half-brother Enlil, Enki is often portrayed as being more sympathetic to humanity. He's the clever one, the innovator, the problem solver, and according to Sitchin, the one primarily responsible for the actual creation, or rather genetic modification of human beings. He's the maverick, the one who might bend the rules if it served a greater purpose, or perhaps if he just found the rules a bit dull. You get the sense Enki would be the one trying to explain to Enlil, "Look, they're not that bad, they just need a little guidance and maybe some better tools for gold mining." The dynamic between Enlil and Enki is classic. The by-the-book commander versus the brilliant, perhaps too curious scientist. Order versus innovation. Duty versus a burgeoning sense of compassion, or at least responsibility for their creations. Many of the major plot points in the Anunnaki saga revolve around their disagreements, their conflicting agendas, and their struggles for influence. It was a cosmic chess game played out on the surface of our planet, with humanity often caught in the middle. Beyond these two heavyweights, there was a whole host of other important Anunnaki figures. There was Ninhursag, also known as Ninmah or Ninti, a prominent goddess, often described as Enlil and Enki's half-sister. She was a chief medical officer and geneticist, playing a crucial role alongside Enki in the creation of humankind. She's the lady of the embryo, the lady who gives life. She had a complex relationship with both brothers, sometimes siding with one, sometimes the other, and occasionally getting fed up with both of them in their celestial testosterone contests. It's a mainstream historical fact that Ninhursag was a major Sumerian mother goddess figure, associated with fertility, childbirth, and the earth itself, long before Sitchin connected her to alien genetics labs. Her temples were widespread, and her importance in the pantheon is undeniable. Then there were the sons and daughters of these main players, who also had significant roles. Figures like Nannar/Sin, god of the moon, son of Enlil, Utu/Shamash, god of the sun and justice, son of Nannar or sometimes Enlil, Inanna/Ishtar, goddess of love, fertility, and warfare, twin sister of Utu, and a particularly feisty and ambitious character. Talk about a diva, and Marduk, Enki's son, who eventually rises to prominence in Babylon, but that's a whole other epic. These younger Anunnaki had their own ambitions, their own territories on Earth to manage, and their own rivalries, often mirroring or exacerbating the conflicts of their parents. Imagine interoffice politics, but with gods who can throw lightning bolts or command armies. Here's a quirky tidbit. Inanna/Ishtar is famous for her descent into the underworld, a myth where she travels to the realm of the dead, is stripped of her powers and possessions at 7 gates, and is eventually rescued. Sitchin, of course, saw this not just as a symbolic journey, but perhaps as a literal journey, or even an account of a power struggle with her sister Ereshkigal, queen of the underworld. So you have Anu overseeing things from Nibiru, Enlil as the somewhat grumpy commander-in-chief on Earth, Enki as the brilliant but often rebellious head of R&D and human resources in a very literal sense, Ninhursag as the chief medical officer with a no-nonsense attitude, and a host of other divine administrators, regional managers, and ambitious princelings all jostling for power and prestige. It's a complex, dynamic, and very human picture of these supposed alien gods. Their motivations, their jealousies, their loves, their hatreds, it all feels surprisingly relatable, even if the scale of their actions is cosmic. This familial structure and inherent dramas within it are key to understanding the unfolding Anunnaki story as Sitchin presented it, a story that was about to take a critical turn as the initial purpose of their Earth mission became paramount. Alright, so we have our cast of celestial characters, the Anunnaki royal family and their entourage, making themselves at home, so to speak, on planet Earth. But why all the fuss? Why travel across the vastness of space, a journey Sitchin suggests was perilous and complex, even for them, to this particular blue-green marble? Was it for the scenic views, the burgeoning, if primitive, local culture, the aforementioned Sumerian beer, which, while excellent, might not be worth a multi-millennial interstellar trip for the entire ruling class of another planet? No, according to Sitchin's interpretation of those clay tablets, the Anunnaki had a very specific, very urgent, and surprisingly pragmatic reason for their Earth expedition: gold. Not just any gold, mind you, and not for the reasons we typically associate with a precious metal, like crafting gaudy jewelry for divine rock stars or backing a celestial currency. The Anunnaki, Sitchin proposed, needed gold for a far more critical purpose: the survival of their home planet Nibiru. He theorized that Nibiru was facing an atmospheric crisis. Its atmosphere was eroding, thinning out, possibly due to natural processes or perhaps even some past catastrophe on their world. Without a stable atmosphere, life on Nibiru was becoming increasingly untenable, its inhabitants exposed to harsh cosmic radiation and facing a slow, inexorable environmental collapse. It's a scenario that feels uncomfortably familiar, doesn't it? A planet in peril due to atmospheric degradation. Maybe they had their own version of cosmic climate change. The solution, according to the Anunnaki's advanced science, was to suspend fine particles of gold in Nibiru's upper atmosphere. This golden shield, Sitchin suggested, would reflect sunlight and heat, patch the holes, and stabilize their world's climate, effectively creating a planetary sunscreen. It sounds a bit like some of the geoengineering ideas being floated around today to combat our own climate issues, which is either a curious coincidence or an indication that Sitchin was tapping into some fundamental principles of planetary science, albeit through an ancient alien filter. It's a mainstream historical fact that gold is indeed highly reflective, non-reactive, and can be beaten into incredibly thin sheets, gold leaf, making it theoretically plausible for certain atmospheric or radiation shielding applications, though the scale Sitchin proposes is, of course, monumental. So, the desperate need for vast quantities of gold became the primary driver for their interstellar ventures. They scanned the solar system, and Earth, it turned out, was the jackpot. Our planet, rich in mineral resources, held significant deposits of the precious metal they so urgently required. And thus, Mission Earth was greenlit by Anu and the ruling council on Nibiru. The first Anunnaki expeditions, led by Enki, were essentially prospecting missions. He splashed down in the Persian Gulf, or so the texts read by Sitchin imply with their descriptions of him arriving by water, and established their first base Eridu, near the marshy river deltas where gold could be extracted from the waters. Eridu, home of the first gold pan, perhaps. The initial plan, it seems, was for the Anunnaki themselves to do the dirty work. You can almost picture these highly advanced beings, grumbling as they waded through mud and sifted river sediment. My dear Enlil, one might have complained to another over their version of a walkie-talkie. Did we really travel 300 million miles to get mud on our divine boots? There must be a better way. Mining gold, especially in the quantities they needed, was arduous, backbreaking labor, even with their presumably advanced technology. They established mining operations not just in Mesopotamia, but according to Sitchin's later interpretations, in southeastern Africa, where vast gold deposits were known. This is where he connects the Anunnaki to ancient African gold mines, some of which show evidence of activity tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years ago. Historians still argue whether these extremely ancient African mines were the work of early Homo sapiens for purely terrestrial purposes, or if they represent something more enigmatic, perhaps fitting into a larger, as yet ununderstood narrative of resource extraction. The texts describe the Anunnaki toiling in the Abzu, a term Sitchin interpreted not just as Enki's watery domain, but specifically as the deep mines of southern Africa. They dug, they processed, they refined. And for a long time, this was the status quo. Groups of Anunnaki, perhaps a lower rank or a specialized corps, were tasked with this vital but unpleasant labor. These were the ones who were really getting their hands dirty, far from the more comfortable command centers and temples being established in Sumer. Here's a quirky tidbit. The Sumerian word for gold is Ku, Gi or Gyukin. Sitchin often emphasized the Ku part, linking it to sacredness or divinity, implying gold was inherently special to the gods beyond its material properties. Whether this linguistic link holds up to rigorous academic scrutiny is debated, but it adds another layer to the Anunnaki's golden obsession. It wasn't just a material. It was a divine material, essential for their survival, and perhaps imbued with other, more esoteric properties. Imagine the logistics of this operation. Transporting tons of refined gold from Earth back to Nibiru, presumably during its periodic close approaches every 3,600 years. This would require sophisticated shuttlecraft, orbital stations, and a level of celestial coordination that's mind-boggling. Sitchin found hints of this in the texts, interpreting descriptions of skyships and divine journeys through the heavens as literal accounts of these transport operations. He saw the ziggurats not just as temples, but perhaps also as launch platforms or guidance systems, their stepped architecture pointing skyward for a reason. The pressure to produce gold was immense. Nibiru's atmospheric shield needed constant replenishment. The Anunnaki on Earth were under a cosmic deadline. Enlil, as mission commander, would have been pushing for quotas, for efficiency, for results. You can imagine the quarterly reports back to Anu being rather stressful if gold production was down. Yes, Father Anu, about that last shipment, we had a slight issue with a rebellious river god and a shortage of divine pickaxes, but we're back on track mostly. This relentless drive for gold, this singular focus of their earthly endeavor, set the stage for much of what followed. It was the reason they were here, the reason they invested so much time and resources, and as we'll see, it was the reason they eventually needed to find a new labor force. The Anunnaki themselves, despite their advanced nature, were apparently not immune to the frustrations and hardships of manual labor, especially when it stretched on for millennia. Their golden quest was foundational to their entire story on Earth, the MacGuffin that drove the plot, leading directly to one of the most controversial and transformative acts attributed to them, the creation of humanity as a worker race. The need was great, the task was grueling, and someone or something was going to have to do the digging. So there they were, the Anunnaki, our supposed celestial landlords, toiling away in the gold mines, presumably mostly in those southern African operations Sitchin pinpointed, the Abzu. For centuries, perhaps even millennia, they endured the hardship. Imagine these beings, capable of interstellar travel, possessing knowledge that could manipulate the very fabric of existence, or at least planetary atmospheres, now reduced to glorified ditch diggers and ore processors. Even for gods, or beings very much like gods, that's got to get old. You can almost hear the grumbling in the celestial ranks. Another shift in the pit? By Anu's beard, I signed up for cosmic exploration, not eternal rock breaking. The glamour of Mission Earth was probably wearing a bit thin. The texts, as interpreted by Sitchin, describe a growing discontent among the rank-and-file Anunnaki who were assigned this arduous labor. These weren't the high-ranking leaders like Enlil and Enki, who were busy with command, research, and presumably a lot of interdepartmental memos. These were the working-class gods, if you will, the ones Sitchin often identified as the Igigi. Now, the term Igigi in mainstream Mesopotamian scholarship generally refers to a collective of sky gods, sometimes seen as younger or lesser deities compared to the more prominent Anunnaki, residing in the heavens rather than on Earth. Historians still argue whether the Igigi were a distinct group from the Anunnaki, a subset, or simply another term for gods in general, depending on the specific text and period. Sitchin, however, specifically cast the Igigi as those Anunnaki who were tasked with the intense labor in the gold mines and later, those who manned the orbiting space stations and shuttlecraft, ferrying the precious metal. According to Sitchin's narrative, after a prolonged period of this grueling work, some texts mention 40 shars, with a shar being a Nibiruan year equivalent to 3,600 Earth years, which is a very long time to be swinging a cosmic pickaxe. The Igigi had finally had enough. Their patience wore out. Their divine backs ached. They were tired, resentful, and probably dangerously low on morale. So they did what any overworked, underappreciated workforce eventually does. They went on strike. A full-blown mutiny. The Atrahasis epic, a Babylonian text that includes a creation story and a flood account, provides a particularly vivid description of this divine labor dispute. It tells of how the gods had to dig out the rivers and canals, bearing the toil for thousands of years. When the gods, like man, bore the work and suffered the toil, the epic begins. The toil of the gods was great. The work was heavy. The distress was much. Finally, the text recounts, they set fire to their tools, put fire to their spades, and surrounded Enlil's great house, the Eker, in Nippur, demanding an end to their suffering. Imagine the scene. Enlil, the stern mission commander, woken in the middle of the night not by a celestial emergency, but by a chanting, torch-wielding mob of his own kind, essentially shouting, "No more digging. We want a new contract." It must have been quite the shock to his authoritarian system. He was probably reaching for the divine equivalent, a riot shield. Enlil was, understandably, furious and perhaps a little scared. He consulted with Anu and the other senior Anunnaki. What was to be done? They couldn't just vaporize the entire workforce. Gold production would plummet, and Nibiru's atmosphere wasn't going to fix itself. The Igigi had them over a celestial barrel. The crisis was real. The mission was in jeopardy. This wasn't just some minor grumbling. It was an open rebellion that threatened the entire Earth operation. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Atrahasis epic indeed describes a rebellion of lesser gods due to harsh labor, which then leads to the creation of humanity to take over these tasks. Mainstream scholars see this as a mythological explanation for the human condition of toil and for the organization of Sumerian society, where humanity served the gods. Sitchin, of course, saw it as a literal historical account of an alien labor dispute. Enter Enki, the ever-ingenious scientist and problem-solver. While Enlil was fuming and probably drafting new, even harsher work regulations, Enki proposed a radical, almost unthinkable solution. He addressed the assembled Anunnaki leaders, perhaps with a twinkle in his eye, knowing he was about to drop a bombshell. He suggested, "Why don't we create a worker? A primitive worker, capable of understanding orders and performing the labor, to take over the burden from the Igigi." He proposed using the genetic material of an existing hominid already evolving on Earth, Homo erectus, perhaps, or a similar proto-human, and upgrading it, binding upon it the image of the gods, or more accurately, their genetic essence. They would create a hybrid, a slave race, designed specifically for the task of mining gold. This was a revolutionary idea. and a controversial one. The texts hint at debates among the Anunnaki. Was it ethical? Was it wise to create a new sentient or semi-sentient being? What if it got out of control? Spoiler alert, it kind of did eventually, but the need for gold was paramount, and the Ijiji rebellion had forced their hand. Enlil, though initially reluctant and always suspicious of Enki's clever schemes, was eventually persuaded. The plan was approved. The Atom Project, if you will, was greenlit. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some interpretations of the Atrahasis epic mention that one of the rebel Ijiji leaders, a god named Geshtui, described as having intelligence, was sacrificed, and his blood and spirit were mixed with clay by the mother goddess, Ninhursag/Mami, to create the first humans. This has been interpreted by some, Sitchin included, as a symbolic reference to using Anunnaki genetic material, the blood and spirit, perhaps DNA and consciousness traits, in the creation process. Talk about taking one for the team, albeit posthumously. The Ijiji revolt, therefore, was a pivotal moment in the Anunnaki saga and, by extension, in Sitchin's version of human history. It was the catalyst that shifted the Anunnaki from being direct laborers to becoming overseers and managers. It moved them from the mines to the laboratories. The striking workers unknowingly set in motion the very event that would lead to the existence of Homo sapiens, according to this narrative. It was a classic case of unintended consequences, a cosmic domino effect. The tired muscles and fiery protests of a group of alien miners directly led to the "let us make man in our image" moment. Without the Ijiji throwing down their divine shovels, humanity, in this specific Anunnaki-engineered form, might never have come to be. The gold would have remained in the ground or been extracted far more slowly. Nibiru's fate would have been uncertain, and our own origin story would be, well, whatever the boring old science books say. But where's the fun in that when you can have striking alien gods and genetic engineering at the dawn of time? The Ijiji had thrown down their celestial tools, their torches had illuminated Enlil's residence with the fiery glow of rebellion, and the Anunnaki leadership was in a bind. Gold production had ground to a halt. Nibiru's atmospheric SOS calls were probably getting more frantic, and something drastic had to be done. Enki, ever the resourceful scientist, had put forth his audacious proposal. Let's not just find workers, let's make them. Let's create a Lulu, a primitive worker, by upgrading the local earthly fauna. The task of this monumental feat of genetic engineering fell primarily to Enki and Ninhursag, also known as Ninma or Ninti, the Lady of Life. Ninhursag, remember, was the chief medical officer, a skilled biologist, and often portrayed as Enki's half-sister, a key figure in the Anunnaki hierarchy with a deep understanding of life processes. She was the one with a delicate touch, the one who could nurture a fragile new creation. If Enki was the ideas guy, the brilliant theorist, Ninhursag was the one who could make it happen in the petri dish, or whatever the Anunnaki equivalent was, perhaps a very fancy clay pot. The Sumerian and Babylonian texts, particularly the Atrahasis epic and other creation myths like the Eridu Genesis, provide surprisingly detailed, if often poetically veiled, accounts of this process. Sitchin and other proponents of the ancient astronaut theory interpret these myths not as symbolic allegories, but as garbled, yet essentially factual recollections of advanced scientific procedures. They describe Enki and Ninhursag working in a special laboratory, a house of creation or Bit Shimti, house where destinies are determined. The raw material for this new being was to be an existing hominid native to Earth. Sitchin specifically suggested Homo erectus, who was already walking upright, using tools, and had a reasonably developed brain, but lacked the full spark of godlike intelligence and perhaps the physical dexterity needed for sophisticated mining tasks. They weren't looking to create a philosophical companion, at least not initially. They needed a beast of burden with opposable thumbs and the ability to follow instructions. Fetch gold, Lulu. Good Lulu. The process described in the texts involves mixing the clay of the earth, representing the native hominid's physical substance, with the blood or essence of a god. As we touched upon, one story even mentions the sacrifice of a minor god, Geshtui, whose intelligence and spirit were used. Sitchin interpreted this quite literally. Anunnaki DNA, their genetic code, was to be combined with the DNA of Homo erectus. This wasn't just about making them stronger or smarter in a general way. It was about binding the image of the gods upon them, creating a being in the Anunnaki's likeness, at least to a functional degree. Perhaps it meant giving them similar enough biology to understand Anunnaki speech, or to operate certain simpler tools. It was a genetic upgrade, a fast-forwarding of evolution by millions of years. The texts describe several attempts, trial and error. Ninhursag, it seems, had a few initial failures. Some creatures were deformed, infertile, or didn't meet the required specifications. You can imagine the cosmic equivalent of a frustrated scientist sighing, "Back to the drawing board," or, in this case, the primordial soup. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some Sumerian texts describe Ninhursag creating several flawed human prototypes after getting a bit tipsy on beer during a feast with Enki. It's a wonderfully humanizing detail for a goddess. Even divine geneticists apparently shouldn't drink in design. Or perhaps it's a mythological way of explaining birth defects or the diversity of human forms. Either way, it suggests the process wasn't a simple one-shot success. It took refinement, adjustments, and maybe a celestial hangover cure. Finally, they achieved a breakthrough. The perfect model was created, Adamu, a name strikingly similar to the biblical Adam. The texts often mention the creation of a male and then a female counterpart, Tiamat or Lilith in some traditions, though Sitchin focused on Adamu as the first successful prototype. The method described involves Enki providing the essence and Ninhursag performing the delicate procedure, possibly involving something akin to in vitro fertilization and implantation into a surrogate mother, perhaps even Anunnaki females at first, or specially selected hominid females. The texts speak of birth goddesses assisting Ninhursag, which Sitchin interpreted as Anunnaki nurses or medical technicians. The result was Homo sapiens, a new species intelligently designed, yet still mortal and subservient. They were given greater intelligence than their hominid ancestors, the ability to use tools more effectively, to understand commands, and crucially, to perform the backbreaking labor in the gold mines. The Anunnaki had their workforce. The Igigi could finally hang up their divine pickaxes and perhaps take on less strenuous roles, like managing the new human workers or piloting the shuttlecraft. Problem solved, right? Well, mostly that it's a mainstream historical fact that Homo sapiens appeared in Africa around 300,000 to 200,000 years ago. And the out-of-Africa theory describes their subsequent migration across the globe. The timeline Sitchin proposes for the Anunnaki creation of Adamu around 300,000 years ago aligns intriguingly with this paleontological evidence for the emergence of anatomically modern humans. Mainstream science, of course, attributes this emergence to natural evolutionary processes, not alien intervention. However, proponents of the Anunnaki theory see this alignment as compelling evidence for their version of events. The newly created humans were put to work. They toiled in the mines of the Abzu, they dug canals, they built cities, all under the watchful eyes of their Anunnaki masters. The burden of labor was lifted from the gods, and gold production presumably ramped up. For a while, the system worked. But creating a being in their image, even a diluted image, came with unforeseen consequences. These new humans were not just unthinking automatons. They could learn, they could adapt, and perhaps most importantly, they could procreate. Initially, Sitchin suggests the Adamu were created as sterile hybrids, like mules, to prevent them from breeding uncontrollably. But Enki, ever the tinkerer and perhaps with a more long-term vision or a mischievous streak, is often credited in these interpretations with a further genetic modification, giving humans the ability to reproduce on their own. This was apparently done without Enlil's full approval, leading to more tension between the brothers. Enlil wasn't keen on a rapidly expanding human population. They were noisy, they were resource-intensive, and they were, from his perspective, a potential problem. And as humanity began to multiply, it seems Enlil's concerns were not entirely unfounded. The stage was being set for the next major drama in the Anunnaki human saga, the growing displeasure of at least one very powerful god with his increasingly numerous and independent-minded creations. The solution to one problem, the Ajay revolt, had sown the seeds for another. Historians still argue whether the Sumerian creation myths, which depict humanity being created from clay and divine blood to serve the gods, are purely allegorical tales about the human condition and societal roles, or if they preserve a dim memory of a more literal, perhaps even technological origin. For Sitchin and his followers, the answer was clear. These were not just myths, but distorted historical records of our engineered genesis at the hands of extraterrestrial geneticists. Adamu was employee number one, the first of a long line of humans designed for a divine purpose, so the Adamu project was a success, at least from a labor perspective. The gold mines were bustling, the canals were being dug, and the Anunnaki could finally put their feet up, relatively speaking, and supervise. Humanity, now capable of procreation, thanks to Enki's little unauthorized genetic tweak, much to Enlil's chagrin, began to multiply. And multiply. And multiply. Like a lot. What started as a manageable workforce was, over generations, becoming a teeming, sprawling population. And as with any rapidly expanding group, they started to make a bit of noise. Imagine Enlil, stern and order-obsessed, trying to get some cosmic rest in his Nibiru headquarters. But outside, it's a constant hubbub. Humans chattering, humans laughing, humans arguing, humans, well, being human. The Sumerian text, particularly the Atrahasis epic, vividly describe Enlil's growing annoyance. The land became wide, the people became numerous. One passage recounts, the land was bellowing like a bull. The god was disturbed by their uproar. Enlil heard their noise and said to the great gods, oppressive has become the noise of mankind. Because of their noise, I am losing sleep. It's a wonderfully relatable complaint, isn't it? The cosmic equivalent of your neighbor having a loud party when you're trying to sleep. Only in this case, the neighbor is the entire human race, and Enlil has the power to do more than just call the divine police. Enlil, never one for half measures or subtle hints, decided that the human experiment had run its course, or at least needed a serious culling. His patience, already thin when it came to these Lulus, finally snapped. He saw humanity not just as noisy, but as flawed, disobedient, and perhaps even a threat to Anunnaki dominance. Sitchin suggests that there might have been other factors too. Perhaps humans were intermingling with the Anunnaki more than Enlil was comfortable with. There are certainly myths about gods taking human spouses or lovers. Maybe they were learning too much too fast, becoming too godlike for Enlil's liking. Whatever the precise combination of reasons, Enlil resolved to wipe the slate clean. His solution? A great flood, a cataclysm of epic proportions designed to drown the whole noisy, troublesome lot of them. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. The texts describe Enlil bringing his plan before the Anunnaki Council. Not everyone was on board. Enki, in particular, would have been horrified. These were his creations, his children, in a sense. He had a soft spot for humanity, a sense of responsibility. But Enlil was the commander, and his influence, particularly when it came to matters of discipline and planetary control, was immense. He managed to persuade or strong-arm the other Anunnaki into agreeing, or at least, into not interfering. They all took an oath, a solemn vow, not to reveal the impending doom to humankind. The decision was made. Humanity was to be eradicated by a global deluge. Sitchin, of course, connected this mythological great flood with a story that appears in countless cultures around the world, not just in Mesopotamia, to the Anunnaki. He proposed that this wasn't just a particularly bad rainy season. He theorized that the Anunnaki, with their advanced knowledge of Earth systems and perhaps even some nifty planetary-scale technology, either deliberately caused the flood or knew it was coming due to natural celestial events, perhaps related to Nibiru's passage or a shift in Antarctic ice sheets, and chose not to warn humanity. The descriptions in the texts are terrifying. The roar of the flood was like a charging bull. The darkness was total. Not even a god could see his fellow. It was an event designed to leave no survivors. It's a mainstream historical fact that geological evidence points to significant regional flooding events in Mesopotamia in ancient times, particularly around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which could have inspired the flood narratives. For example, Sir Leonard Woolley's excavations at Ur in the 1920s revealed a deep layer of flood silt, which he dramatically proclaimed as evidence of the biblical flood. Thus, most scholars now see it as a localized, albeit severe, event. However, the idea of a single, global flood of the kind described in some myths is not supported by mainstream geology. This is a key point of divergence. Sitchin and his followers see the flood as a worldwide catastrophe orchestrated or foreseen by the Anunnaki, while mainstream science points to regional events amplified by myth. Enlil's reasoning, as presented in the myths, was essentially that humanity had become a failed experiment. They were too loud, too numerous, and perhaps too independent. The solution was a hard reset. He was the divine exterminator, ready to fumigate the planet. You can almost picture him, hands on hips, surveying the earth and thinking, right, this is going to be messy, but it needs to be done. His cold, calculating approach is a stark contrast to Enki's more compassionate, if sometimes rule-bending, nature. This impending flood wasn't just a natural disaster in the Anunnaki narrative. It was a deliberate act of policy, a decision handed down from on high. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some versions of the flood story, like the one in the Epic of Gilgamesh, mention the gods themselves being terrified by the flood they had unleashed. Ishtar, the feisty goddess, is described as crying out like a woman in travail and regretting her part in the decision. "How could I command a war to destroy my people?" she wails. Even Enlil, after the waters subside, seems to have a moment of, well, not exactly remorse, but perhaps a grim acceptance of the devastation. It suggests that even for these powerful beings, unleashing such destructive forces was a sobering experience. Or maybe Ishtar was just upset her favorite shopping district in Shuruppak was now underwater. The Anunnaki themselves, of course, were not going to stick around for the deluge. Sitchin suggests they retreated to their orbiting spacecraft, their celestial boats, to wait out the storm from a safe distance. They watched as the waters rose, as the land was submerged, as the cries of humanity were silenced. For Enlil, it must have been a moment of grim satisfaction. His problem was being washed away. Peace and quiet would finally be restored, or so he thought. He had made a vow, and he had ensured the other gods made a vow, that no human would survive. But Enlil, for all his power and authority, had underestimated one crucial factor: his clever, compassionate, and slightly rebellious half-brother Enki. The Lord of Wisdom had a plan of his own, a secret countermove in this divine game of life and death. The flood of fury was unleashed, but the story of humanity wasn't quite over yet. Historians still argue whether the pervasiveness of flood myths across diverse and geographically separated ancient cultures points to a shared memory of a single ancient cataclysmic event, or if it's simply a common mythological archetype arising from universal human experiences with devastating local floods. It's a debate that touches upon the very nature of myth, memory, and the possibility of ancient global events that have been largely forgotten by conventional history. Enlil's plan was in full, terrifying motion. The heavens had opened, or the cosmic orchestra of destruction was in full swing. Enlil's carefully orchestrated, perhaps the Antarctic ice cap had slipped, or maybe the Anunnaki had just turned on some colossal, planet-sized or perhaps gleefully anticipated, great flood was underway. The texts paint a terrifying picture. Wind howled, waters surged taps. Whatever the mechanism, the waters were rising, a churning, muddy torrent engulfing the earth, sweeping away cities from below and rain down from above. Darkness enveloped the world. The Anunnaki, having made their pact of silence, villages, and the teeming, noisy human population that had so irritated the Anunnaki commander, from their vantage point in orbit and non-intervention, had retreated to their sky-borne vessels, watching the devastation unfold from a safe, albeit probably, the Anunnaki watched the destruction. For Enlil, this was the ultimate mute button. For rather grim, orbital vantage point. You can imagine some of them, perhaps even Ishtar as she lamented her lost human worshippers, the other gods who had sworn an oath of secrecy, Perhaps there was a mixture of fear, awe, and maybe even a touch of "and their offerings," peeking through the celestial portholes with a mixture of fear and awe. Enlil, presumably regret, as Ishtar's wailing suggested. But an oath was an oath, and humanity, it seemed, was feeling a sense of grim accomplishment. His noisy, troublesome human problem was being decisively solved. The slate was being doomed. However, Enlil had made one critical miscalculation. He'd underestimated his brother Enki's deep-seated connection to his creations and his remarkable talent for finding loopholes in divine decrees. Enki, the god of wisdom, wiped clean. But, as we know, Enlil had reckoned without the ingenuity and compassion, or perhaps the scientist, the one who had argued against humanity's destruction, was not about to let his children be stubbornness of his half-brother Enki. Enki, the co-creator of humanity, the one who had argued, completely wiped out. He was bound by the oath not to directly warn mankind. But Enki was a master against their destruction, was bound by the Anunnaki Council's oath not to directly warn mankind, and of indirect communication, a veritable god of plausible deniability. If he couldn't speak to a human, perhaps oath among gods is a serious business, not something to be trifled with, even for a clever deity like Enki. He could speak to a wall. The Epic of Gilgamesh gives us the most famous version of this clever, so a direct phone call to his favorite human saying, "Hey, build a boat, big one like asterisk workaround." Enki, knowing he cannot break his vow to the Anunnaki Council, goes to the reed hut off really asterisk big. Was out of the question. Enlil would have had his divine hide for that, son a man named Utnapishtim. In the Sumerian version, he's called Zeusidra. In the Biblicalki, ever the master of loopholes and indirect communication, found a clever workaround. The Sumerian Epic of Gilgamesh narrative, he's Noah, same character, different ancient calling card. Instead of speaking to Utnapishtim directly, in Tablet 11, tells the story of Utnapishtim. His name means he who found life. A devout Enki speaks to the reed wall of the hut. Reed hut, wall, and righteous man from the city of Shurapak. Sitchin and many others see Utnapishtim as he proclaims, "Reed hut, hearken. Wall, reflect. Man of Shurapak, son of Ubar, the Sumerian precursor to the biblical Noah. Enki, wanting to save this good man and, through him, to tear down your house and build a boat. Abandon possessions and look for life. Despise property remnant of humanity and other living creatures, couldn't speak to Utnapishtim face to face. Instead, be and keep the soul alive. Aboard the boat take the seed of all living things." It's a beautifully sly-move story goes. Enki spoke to the wall of Utnapishtim's reed hut. "Reed hut, wall." Enki proclaimed, addressing the structure itself. "Reed hut, hearken. I wasn't talking to him, Your Honor. I was merely addressing the fascinating acoustic properties of this particular wattle and daub construction. You can almost hear Enki winking at the cosmos. Udwal, pay attention. Man of Shurapak, son of Ubertutu, demolish your house, Apishtim, presumably a very astute man and perhaps already one of Enki's favorite devotees, got the message loud, build a boat. Abandon possessions, seek life. Forswear goods, preserve life. Make all living seeds go up into the boat. It's a wonderfully cunning piece of divine misdirection." I wasn't talking to him, in and clear. He was to build a massive, specially designed boat, an ark. The instructions, as relayed by Enki via the wall, were remarkably specific. The dimensions of the vessel, the need for it to be watertight with bitumen and lil. I was just having a rather animated conversation with his house. Can't a god admire some quality in a Mesopotamian architecture? You can almost see Enki winking as he delivers this message to the inanimate wall, knowing full well that Utnapishtim pitch, the construction of multiple decks, and the crucial directive to bring aboard his family, skilled craftsmen, and the seed of all on the other side, was getting an earful of life-saving instructions. Utnapishtim understandably perplexed living things, animals 2 by 2, or perhaps their genetic essence depending on how you interpret seed. It was a floating genetic bank, a survival capsule for life on Earth. Utnapishtim, understandably, was a bit but presumably astute enough to realize a god talking to his wall was probably a message he should heed. Did exactly as he concerned about how his neighbors might react to him suddenly building a giant houseboat in the middle of landlocked Shurapak was overheard to do. He dismantled his house, using the materials to construct a massive cube-shaped ark. "What shall I say to the city, the people, and the elders?" he asks. Enki, ever the pragmatist or more traditionally boat-shaped vessel, depending on the translation and interpretation, the precise design is a matter of some, gives him a wonderfully devious excuse. Tell them that Enlil is angry with you, and you can no longer live debate. The instructions were specific. The boat was to be of immense size, sealed with bitumen and pitch to make it waterproof, in his land or city, so you're building a boat to go down to the Abzuv, the deep waters, to live with Lord Enki, who is your friend. And as a bonus, once you're gone, Enlil will, and it needed to have multiple decks. Utnapishtim was also instructed to load it not just with his family and shower the city with a profusion of birds, a rain of fishes, basically promising prosperity once the undesirable you craftsman, but with the seed of all living things, animals, and provisions. It was a genetic lifeboat, a floating zoological preserve, designed to weather the coming storm and repopulate the world afterwards. It's a mainstream Utnapishtim leaves. It's a brilliant piece of misdirection, designed to get the boat built quickly, without too historical fact that the Epic of Gilgamesh, containing this detailed flood narrative featuring Utnapishtim, predates the biblical many awkward questions. Oh, Utnapishtim's building a giant boat? Good riddance. More fish for us. Account of Noah by at least 1,000 years, highlighting its significance as one of the world's oldest surviving examples of such little did they know. So Utnapishtim and his hired hands worked feverishly. It's a mainstreamist story. The construction must have been a frantic race against time, with Utnapishtim's neighbors probably thinking historical fact that the Mesopotamians were skilled boat builders, using materials like reeds, wood, and bitumen, natural asphalt. For waterproofing, he'd finally lost his marbles. Building a giant box in the middle of dry land, Utnapishtim? Expect, essential for river travel and trade in the Tigris and Euphrates, the construction of a large, seaworthy vessel, a bit of rain, are we? Little did they know. Once the ark was completed and loaded, the flood, while a monumental task, was within the realm of their technological capabilities, especially with divine instructions. The ark was completed just in the nick of time, as the first signs of the cataclysm appeared. Utnapishtim loaded his family. The waters came, just as Enki, via the wall, had warned. The descriptions are harrowing. Utnapishtim seals himself inside, and for 6 days and 7 nights, or 7 days and 7 nights, accounts vary slightly. The animals, the craftsmen, and all the provisions sealed the hatch and waited. Then the storm hit. With all storm rages, the world drowns. Even the gods, watching from above, are described as cowering like beaten the fury Enlil had intended. For 6 days and 7 nights, the duration varies slightly in different texts. The deluge dogs, terrified by the ferocity of the deluge they themselves had sanctioned. After the storm subsided, Utnapishtim raged. The world was plunged into darkness and chaos. When the waters finally began to subside, and Utnapishtim cautiously's ark came to rest on the peak of Mount Nazur, or Mount Ararat in the later, more familiar biblical tradition opened a hatch, the scene was one of utter devastation. I looked at the weather. Stillness had set in. He sent out a dove, then a swallow, then a raven to see if the waters had receded enough, for he recounts. And all of mankind had returned to clay. His boat had come to rest on the peak of Mount Land to be found. When the raven didn't return, he knew it was safe to disembark. He opened Nazur, or Mount Ararat in the biblical tradition. He released a dove, then a swallow, then a raven to the ark, and made a sacrifice, an offering of thanks. The aroma of the roasting meat drifted upwards, and the text see if the land was dry enough to disembark. When Enlil discovered that a handful of humans had survived, he say the gods gathered like flies around the offering, famished after their ordeal, and perhaps relieved that something, anything, was, to put it mildly, incandescent with rage. Has a human being escaped? No man was to survive the destruction had survived. Enlil, however, was not amused when he arrived and saw the ark and its occupants. He bellowed. He immediately suspected Enki, who, after some prodding, fessed up to his little was furious. How did any mortal survive? No man was to live through the destruction, he raged. He knew chat with a wall. Historians still argue whether the striking similarities between the Mesopotamian flood narratives, like those in Gil's, someone must have broken the oath. All eyes presumably turned to Enki, who probably tried to look as innocent as a divinigame Shanatrahasis, and the Genesis account of Noah indicate direct borrowing by the biblical authors. The shared common scientist caught red-handed genetically modifying humanity could look. Historians still argue whether the similarities between the Mesopotamian flood source or independent traditions arising from similar regional experiences. The debate highlights the complex interplay of cultural transmission and mythological development in the ancient myths. Gilgamesh, Atrahasis, and the biblical story of Noah represent direct literary borrowing, a shared oral Near East. But then something interesting happened. Perhaps it was seeing the utter desolation, perhaps it was the pleased tradition stemming from a common ancient event, or independent mythic responses to the reality of devastating floods in their respective regions. Asterisk of the other gods, Ishtar was still pretty upset. Or perhaps it was Utnapishtim's prompt offering of a sacrifice as a complex question of cultural transmission and mythogenesis. Enki eventually confessed, or rather, explained his clever ruse of talking to the wall. He argued with Enlil, pointing out the injustice of punishing the righteous along with the wicked, the smell of roasting meat apparently being quite appealing to even angry deities after a long flood. But Enlil's fury began to abate. He seemed to realize that completely wiping out humanity might have been an overreaction. Or maybe, as Sitchin might, in the folly of completely destroying their painstakingly created workforce. Perhaps Enlil, seeing the utter devastation and maybe even feeling a TW suggest, he realized they still needed some workers, even if they were a bit noisy. In a remarkable inga of regret, or just realizing the practical problem of having no one to mine gold if everyone was dead, Rel turnaround, Enlil, though still grumpy, blessed Utnapishtim and his wife, granting them immortality or a tinted. Or perhaps he was simply outmaneuvered by Enki and faced with a fait accompli. Here leased a very, very long life and special remote place to live, far away, at the mouth's a quirky tidbit. In the Gilgamesh epic, after Enlil's initial anger, he seems to have a change of heart, or at least accepts the outcome. He boards Utnapishtim's boat, touches of the rivers. Humanity was given a second chance, albeit with some new conditions, shorter lifespans, disease, and other the foreheads of Utnapishtim and his wife, and blesses them, granting them immortality, making them like the hardships were introduced, perhaps as a way to keep their numbers in check this time. The Great Reset was not as total gods. This was a unique boon, not extended to the rest of recovering humanity. So Utnapishtim gets to live forever as Enlil had planned, thanks to Enki's cleverness and Utnapishtim's faith. They're on a remote island, probably spending his days telling rather damp and dramatic stories to any passing seabirds. So thanks Ark had weathered the storm, carrying the fragile spark of human and animal life through the watery abyss, ensuring that Enlil to Enki's ingenuity and Utnapishtim's obedience, and presumably some excellent boat-building skills, humanity's fury wouldn't be the final word in humanity's story. Here's a quirky tidbit was saved from total annihilation. A bottleneck had occurred, but the species survived. The Anunnaki's grand plan in some versions of the myth, after the flood, the gods decide to create different types of infertile humans, or a human-free earth had been thwarted, or at least significantly amended. The world was now a blank, introduce infant mortality to control population growth, a rather grim form of divine family planning. It shows the Anunnaki were still muddy slate, ready to be repopulated and rebuilt, under the continued, if perhaps now slightly more cautious supervision, very much concerned with managing their human resources, even after nearly drowning them all. The Ark's escape wasn't just of their celestial overlords. The relationship between gods and humans had been irrevocably altered by this cataclysm and the unlucky break. It was a divinely orchestrated, albeit secret rescue mission. The waters of the Great Flood had receded, leaving behind a world scoured clean, a muddy, silent testament to Enlil's fury and, ultimately, to Enki's enduring, if somewhat sneaky, protectiveness of his human creations. Utnapishtim and his family, along with their precious cargo of all living seeds, had disembarked from the ark, probably onto the slopes of Mount Nazur or a similar peak that had first emerged from the receding waters. Humanity, or what little was left of it, had been given a second chance. But what now? How do you rebuild a civilization from scratch when your entire world has just been through a cosmic washing machine set to apocalypse? This is where the Anunnaki, according to Sitchin's narrative, once again stepped in. They couldn't just leave their carefully re-preserved workforce to fend for themselves entirely. The gold still needed to be mined for Nibiru, after all. Perhaps Enlil, having had his moment of destructive catharsis, and perhaps having been subtly, or not so subtly, chastised by the other Anunnaki who missed their human servants and the various comforts they provided, recognized the need to re-establish order and, more importantly, productivity. The post-Diluvian world needed a new framework, a new societal structure, and the Anunnaki were just the beings to provide it. This is where the Sumerian concept of kingship comes into sharp focus. The Sumerian king list, a fascinating and often puzzling document, famously begins with the line, "When kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Eridu." It then lists a series of kings who ruled for astonishingly long periods, thousands, even tens of thousands of years, before the flood. After the flood, the king list continues. Kingship was again lowered from heaven, this time to the city of Kish. The reigns of these post-flood kings, while still impressively long by human standards, were significantly shorter than their antediluvian predecessors. Sitchin and other ancient astronaut theorists seize upon this concept of kingship lowered from heaven as literal truth. For them, it means that the Anunnaki themselves initially ruled directly over humanity, or appointed human rulers who were either direct Anunnaki offspring, heavily augmented humans, or at least individuals who had their express divine mandate. These weren't just metaphorically divine rulers. They were, in a very real sense, connected to the sky gods. They were the intermediaries, the managers who would ensure that human society developed in a way that served Anunnaki interests. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Sumerian king list is a genuine ancient document, and its early sections listing kings with incredibly long reigns are generally considered mythological or symbolic by most historians, representing an idealized past rather than literal historical chronology. Scholars suggest these vast lifespans might symbolize the divine nature of early kingship or the great antiquity of the institution itself. In the post-flood world, Sitchin theorized, the Anunnaki re-established centers of civilization, new cities built upon the ruins of the old, or in entirely new locations. They retaught humanity the arts of agriculture, building, writing, and societal organization. They laid down laws, established religious practices, centered around the worship of themselves, naturally, and set up a new political order. And at the head of this new order were the kings, chosen by the gods, often claiming divine parentage. This is where we encounter the demigods, the heroes of myth who were part human, part god. The most famous of these, and a central figure in Mesopotamian literature, is Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes him as two-thirds god and one-third man. The king of Uruk, a figure of immense strength, courage, and initially a rather tyrannical disposition. He builds great walls, he oppresses his people, and he seeks fame and glory. His story is a rich tapestry of adventure, friendship with the wild man Enkidu, created by the gods to temper Gilgamesh, and a poignant quest for immortality after Enkidu's death, which ultimately leads him to Utnapishtim, the flood hero, who tells him the story of his survival. Sitchin and his adherents see figures like Gilgamesh not as purely mythical characters, but as historical individuals who were indeed of mixed Anunnaki human heritage. Their superhuman abilities, their close relationship with the gods, who often intervene directly in their lives, giving advice, weapons, or obstacles, and their royal status are all seen as evidence of their Anunnaki bloodline. These demigod kings were the perfect bridge between the divine rulers and the human populace. They understood both worlds to some extent, and could enforce the will of the Anunnaki while also, sometimes, caring for the welfare of their human subjects. They were the first hybrid rulers, combining the longevity and power of their divine ancestors with a more relatable human form. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some versions of the Gilgamesh epic, after his failed quest for eternal life, Gilgamesh is granted a special knowledge by Utnapishtim. He is shown a secret of the gods, often interpreted as knowledge about the past, or perhaps even some form of divine technology or wisdom. This further reinforces the idea of these heroes having access to privileged, Anunnaki-derived information. Maybe Utnapishtim gave him the instruction manual for rebuilding civilization, or at least the IKEA assembly guide for a new ziggurat. The concept of divine kingship wasn't unique to Sumer. You see it in ancient Egypt, where the pharaoh was considered a living god, an incarnation of Horus. You see it in other ancient cultures too, where rulers often trace their lineage back to divine ancestors or claim to rule by divine right. For ancient astronaut theorists, this is not a coincidence. It's a global pattern, a legacy of Anunnaki influence, where they established similar systems of rule in different parts of the world, placing their chosen and often related individuals in charge. These rulers, imbued with a measure of divine power and knowledge, were tasked with guiding humanity's development, ensuring stability, and, of course, keeping the resources flowing, whether it was gold, agricultural surplus, or simply human devotion. Historians still argue whether the widespread motif of divine kingship in ancient cultures reflects a universal human tendency to legitimize power through sacred authority, or if it points to cross-cultural diffusion of a specific ideological complex, possibly originating in the Near East. The debate touches on how political authority was constructed and maintained in early states, and the role of religion in that process. So, in the wake of the flood, you have a world being repopulated and reorganized. The Anunnaki, perhaps a little more cautious now, are still pulling the strings, but often through these appointed, divinely connected kings and demigod heroes. These figures, like Gilgamesh, stand with one foot in the human world and one in the divine, embodying the complex, ongoing relationship between humanity and its purported creators. They were the living proof of the Anunnaki presence, a tangible link to those who came from the sky. Their stories, their struggles, their triumphs all became part of the foundational myths of the new post-Diluvian world, a world where humanity lived under the shadow and the guidance of their hybrid rulers and the alien gods who had decided, after all, not to completely give up on them. The waters had receded, kingship had been relowered from heaven, and humanity, under the guidance of divinely appointed and often divinely related rulers, was getting back on its feet. The Anunnaki, it seems, weren't content to just rebuild Mesopotamia. If Sitchin's grand narrative is to be believed, their influence, and indeed their physical presence, extended far beyond the Fertile Crescent. As human populations grew and dispersed after the flood, or perhaps as the Anunnaki themselves established new operational centers or explored for more resources, their telltale signs, according to proponents, began to appear in the most unexpected corners of the globe. You start to see these curious connections when you look at ancient megalithic sites around the world. Think of places like Baalbek in Lebanon with its trilithon, 3 colossal stone blocks weighing an estimated 800 tons each, forming part of a Roman temple platform, but with foundations that many, including Sitchin, believe are far, far older. How did ancient people, even the Romans with their impressive engineering, quarry, transport, and lift such unimaginably massive stones? Mainstream archaeology offers explanations involving vast amounts of manpower, levers, rollers, and ramps. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Romans were indeed capable of incredible engineering feats, and Baalbek's temple complex is a testament to their skill, though the precise methods for moving the largest stones remain a subject of some debate and all. Sitchin, however, looked at Baalbek and saw Anunnaki handiwork, a landing platform, perhaps, for their shuttlecraft, built with technology far beyond human capabilities of the time. Those huge stones weren't moved by muscle and ingenuity alone, but by something more advanced. Then you journey in your mind's eye, across the Atlantic to the Andes Mountains of South America, to places like Puma Punku in Bolivia, part of the larger Tiwanaku site. Here, you find incredibly precise stone cuttings, H-shaped blocks that fit together with an almost impossible exactness, smooth, almost polished surfaces, and drill holes that seem to defy explanation by primitive tools. The level of precision is astonishing, almost as if the stone was molded or cut with laser-like devices. Historians still argue whether the intricate stonework at Pumapunku and Tiwanaku was achieved using advanced, lost stoneworking techniques developed by the indigenous cultures over centuries, or if it implies access to tools and knowledge whose origins are currently unknown. Mainstream archaeology generally favors the former, highlighting the ingenuity of the Tiwanaku people, but the sheer perfection and scale still baffle many. For ancient astronaut theorists, Pumapunku screams Anunnaki construction site, perhaps another spaceport, or a processing facility for minerals extracted from the rich Andean mountains. The local legends speak of gods who built these structures in a single night, using sound or other mysterious energies. And what about the Nazca lines in Peru? Those enormous geoglyphs etched into the desert plains, depicting animals, geometric shapes, and long, straight lines, some stretching for miles. They are so large they can only be truly appreciated from the air. Who were they for? Mainstream theories suggest they were ritual pathways, astronomical calendars, or messages to mountain deities. Here's a quirky tidbit. Maria Reich, the German mathematician and archaeologist who dedicated her life to studying and preserving the Nazca lines, believed they were an astronomical calendar and observatory, but even she was puzzled by some of the more abstract and runway-like figures. Sitchin and others proposed a more direct interpretation. These were navigational aids, landing strips, or even doodles left by Anunnaki pilots waiting for clearance to land. Hey and Lil, is this runway 3 or 4? My GPS is on the fritz again. You can almost trace a global breadcrumb trail. The pyramids of Egypt, particularly the Great Pyramid of Giza, with its mathematical precision, its alignment to cardinal directions, and the sheer scale of its construction. While mainstream Egyptology provides detailed theories about how they were built by human labor under the pharaohs, alternative theorists often point to anomalies, the lack of soot from torches in inner chambers, the incredible accuracy of the stone cutting, the sheer logistical challenge, as evidence of non-human or technologically assisted construction. Sitchin saw Giza not primarily as a tomb, but as a crucial component of a global Anunnaki grid, perhaps a beacon or a power station strategically placed. Consider Stonehenge in England, with its massive sarcens and bluestones, transported over considerable distances. Or the ancient cities of the Indus Valley civilization, like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, with their sophisticated urban planning, sanitation systems, and undeciphered script. Could these two bear the fingerprints of Anunnaki guidance, or even direct intervention? The patterns seem to repeat. Advanced knowledge appearing suddenly, monumental construction defying easy explanation, and local myths often speaking of culture bearers or sky gods who taught humanity the arts of civilization. Even seemingly isolated places like Easter Island, Rapa Nui, with its enigmatic Moai statues, get drawn into this web. How were these giant stone figures carved and transported, and why the obsession with these particular forms? While archaeologists have demonstrated plausible methods for their creation and movement by the Rapa Nui people, the sheer effort and the island's remote location keep the mystery alive for some. The argument often made is that these disparate cultures, separated by vast oceans and thousands of years, couldn't have independently developed such similar advanced concepts or undertaken such similar monumental building projects without some common external influence. That influence, of course, is posited to be the Anunnaki, establishing a global network of outposts, mining operations, and perhaps even leisure facilities. One can only hope they had a decent celestial golf course somewhere. This isn't to say that every ancient stone is an alien artifact. But as you drift off, you might ponder the sheer audacity of these ancient builders, whether human or, as some believe, guided by otherworldly hands. The earth is dotted with these silent, imposing sentinels of the past, structures that whisper of immense effort, profound knowledge, and perhaps, just perhaps, a connection to beings who saw our planet not just as a home, but as a project, a resource, a vital stop on an interstellar itinerary. The global footprints are there, etched in stone and legend, The challenge lies in deciphering their true meaning, though. If these Anunnaki were indeed zipping around the globe, supervising the construction of Puma Punku with laser-like precision and using Baalbek as a handy interstellar truck stop, they must have had some pretty impressive gadgets. It's one thing to guide humanity in agriculture and basket weaving. It's quite another to move 800-ton stone blocks or achieve the kind of mathematical precision seen in the Great Pyramid. This is where the ancient texts, when read through that particular Sitchinite lens, start to sound less like mythology and more like a high-tech inventory list from a visiting alien civilization. Think about the descriptions of the gods themselves. They're often described as dazzling, radiant, or possessing a terrifying splendor. While this could easily be poetic hyperbole for divine power, Sitchin and others suggest it might be literal descriptions of the beings themselves, perhaps wearing some kind of advanced suits or emanating energy. Their voices are like thunder. Their gaze can search the heart. These could be metaphors, or they could be garbled accounts of advanced communication devices, or even some form of biofeedback technology. It makes you wonder if their horned crowns, so common in Mesopotamian art, weren't just symbols of divinity, but perhaps functional headgear, part of a life support system or a communication array, like a really fancy ancient Bluetooth headset. Enki to Enlil. Coming in Lil, the humans are complaining about the canteen food again. Then there's the whole issue of flight. The texts are replete with references to gods traversing the skies. Enlil is the lord of the air, and many deities are depicted with wings. Mainstream scholarship interprets these wings symbolically, representing divinity, power, or swiftness. But what if they were literal, or at least represented actual flying craft? Sitchin pointed to Sumerian terms like Mu or Shem, which, remember, he translated as skychamber or rocket, and cylinder seal depictions that he argued showed rocket-like objects or winged discs. He also highlighted the divine black bird or storm bird associated with gods like Ninurta, Enlil's son, a mighty warrior god, suggesting these were not mythical creatures but sophisticated aircraft, perhaps jets or vertical takeoff and landing craft. Imagine a Sumerian farmer looking up and seeing what he could only describe as a giant, noisy, metallic bird descending from the heavens. How else would he explain it? The descriptions of divine weaponry are also particularly evocative. Gods like Ninurta, Ishkur, Adad, and Inanna/Ishtar are often described wielding weapons that unleash storms, lightning, and devastating destruction. They have beams that search the heart of the mountains, weapons that can turn cities to dust, and nets that can ensnare entire armies. The Tablet of Destinies, a powerful artifact that conferred supreme authority, was said to control them, often translated as divine powers or attributes, but Sitchin saw them as something more tangible, perhaps computer programs or control systems for advanced technology. When Marduk battles the chaos monster Tiamat in the Enuma Elish, he uses winds, a net, and an unfaceable weapon to defeat her. Sitchin even suggested that the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in the biblical narrative, which is parallels in Mesopotamian texts describing the smiting of rebellious cities, might have been accomplished using atomic weapons wielded by the Anunnaki. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Enuma Elish describes Marduk using powerful, storm-like weapons in his cosmic battle, which is understood by scholars as a mythological representation of order conquering chaos and the establishment of Marduk's supremacy in the Babylonian pantheon. Sitchin, however, saw this as a more literal account of advanced warfare. Consider the Ark of the Covenant from the Old Testament. While not directly Sumerian, the Anunnaki narrative often bleeds into interpretations of later Semitic texts. Described as a golden chest that housed the Ten Commandments, it was also said to possess immense power, capable of striking people dead if approached improperly and parting waters. Was it merely a sacred relic, or as some fringe theories propose, a piece of Anunnaki technology, a capacitor, a weapon, or a communication device? Here's a quirky tidbit. The biblical descriptions of the Ark often include strict handling protocols and warnings about its dangerous power, which some have likened to instructions for handling a piece of advanced, potentially radioactive equipment. Do not touch. Contents may be divinely energetic. Then there are the descriptions of the gods' abilities. They could seemingly heal the sick, sometimes even resurrect the dead, as Inanna was after her descent into the underworld, with the help of Enki's creations. They possessed immense knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, metallurgy, and genetics, fields in which the Sumerians themselves made remarkable, seemingly sudden advancements. Were these gifts from the gods simply the result of divine inspiration, or were they carefully disseminated pieces of Anunnaki science and technology, doled out as needed to advance human civilization in ways that serve their purposes? Sitchin also pointed to things like the oracle stones or seeing stones mentioned in various myths, suggesting these were communication devices, ancient video phones allowing contact with the Anunnaki on Nibiru or in orbit. The detailed astronomical knowledge of the Sumerians, including their awareness of distant planets like Uranus and Neptune, which Sitchin claimed they knew about, though this is heavily debated by mainstream scholars who argue they only knew the 5 visible planets plus the Sun and Moon, also pointed to an external source of information. How could they know about planets invisible to the naked eye without advanced observational tools, or without being told by someone who had them? Historians still argue whether the sudden bursts of technological and cultural advancement in ancient Sumer, the Sumerian problem of abrupt sophistication, can be fully explained by purely indigenous development and favorable environmental factors, or if it hints at external stimuli or lost knowledge. This debate leaves a conceptual space where theories of alien intervention, however speculative, can take root. So, as you drift into that hazy space between wakefulness and sleep, picture this ancient world not as a primitive, superstitious place, but as a stage for incredible, almost unimaginable technologies. Flying machines crisscrossing the skies, powerful energy weapons shaping the landscape, genetic laboratories creating new life forms, and divine beings consulting shimmering data slates. It's a far cry from the mud huts and reed boats of conventional history, but it's a vision that has captivated many, offering a tantalizing, if unproven, explanation for some of antiquity's most enduring mysteries. The question remains, were these merely poetic metaphors, or were the ancient scribes trying to describe technologies so advanced they could only be attributed to the gods? So, we have these Anunnaki, beings of immense power and advanced technology, running Section 13, a massive gold mining operation on Earth, with a workforce of genetically engineered humans. It sounds like a recipe for... If the Anunnaki were indeed a group of highly advanced, powerful beings from another planet's smooth, efficient, intergalactic enterprise, right? Well, not quite. If there's one thing the Sumerian texts, living and operating on Earth for millennia, you'd expect their society, much like our own, to be less in human nature, teach us, it's that whenever you get a group of powerful individuals together, whether they're then perfectly harmonious. Advanced technology and lofty origins don't necessarily equate to enlightened, peaceful coexistence. In fact, if for human or Nibiruan, drama is inevitable. And the Anunnaki, for all their cosmic wisdom, seem the Sumerian texts, as interpreted by Sitchin, are anything to go by. The Anunnaki had more to have more than their fair share of internal squabbles, rivalries, and outright conflicts. These weren't just in their fair share of drama, rivalries, and outright cosmic feuds. Their internal politics were messy, their family petty disagreements over whose turn it was to pilot the shuttle to the asteroid belt. These were serious power struggles with Earth-sh squabbles epic, and these conflicts often spilled over to affect their human subjects, turning Earth into a chessboard for their power game-shattering consequences. Remember our primary antagonists, Enlil and Enki? The stern commander and the brilliant scientist? They're ideological. Remember our primary antagonists, or perhaps protagonists, depending on your perspective. The half-brothers Enlil and Enki differences and sibling rivalry were a constant source of tension. Enlil focused on order, discipline, and the success of the gold. Their rivalry was the bedrock of much Anunnaki drama. Enlil, the stern commander, focused on order, mission, often clashed with Enki, who was more curious, more compassionate toward humanity, and perhaps a bit too fond of UNS discipline and the Nibiruan mission. Enki, the brilliant scientist, often more sympathetic to humanity, was prone to ancient genetic experiments. Enlil wanted humans to be docile, unquestioning workers. Enki seemed to want them to evolve to independent action and challenging Enlil's authority. This core tension radiated outwards, influencing their descendants and their respective factions, to learn, perhaps even to eventually become partners rather than just servants. This fundamental disagreement colored many of their interactions, and Enlil represented the old guard, the established hierarchy. Enki perhaps the progressive, if sometimes reckless, innovator decisions. Enlil's decision to bring about the Great Flood was the most extreme example of their conflict, with Enki working. Their disagreements weren't just philosophical. They were about control of Earth, control of resources, and control behind the scenes to save humanity against Enlil's wishes. You can imagine the post-flood debriefing of humanity's destiny. This central rivalry was mirrored and amplified by their offspring. Enlil's son, Ninurta Enki, we need to talk about her definition of total annihilation. But the rivalries didn't stop with the two main brothers. Their children, the next generation of Anunnaki leaders on Earth, inherited not only their parents was a mighty warrior god, often depicted as Enlil's enforcer, engaging in epic battles against rebellious gods or monstrous beings. He was loyal to his father and his father's vision of order. On the other side, Enki domains, but also their propensity for conflict. Enlil's lineage, which included figures like Ninurta, his foremost son, Marduk, was ambitious and increasingly powerful. Marduk's rise to prominence is a major theme in later Sun, a warrior god, and Nannar/Sin, the moon god, often found themselves at odds with Enki Babylonian mythology, particularly in the Enuma Elish, where he eventually supplants Enlil as the head of the Pant's lineage, most notably his ambitious and powerful son Marduk. Marduk is a particularly interesting figure, at least in Babylon. Sitchin saw this not just as a theological shift, but as a reflection of a real power. Initially, he wasn't a major player in the Sumerian pantheon. But over time, especially as the city of Babylon rose struggle, a cosmic coup d'etat where Marduk and his faction seized control of key earthly territories, particularly Babylon itself, to prominence, Marduk became its patron deity and eventually the head of the Babylonian pantheon. Then Enuma Elish. This wasn't just a change in who got the best sacrifices. It was a shift in geopolitical power among the Anunnaki. The Babylonian creation epic is essentially a propaganda piece elevating Marduk to supreme status, recounting his heroic battle against Tiamat. Then there was Inanna/Ishtar, a granddaughter of Enlil, or sometimes Anu, depending on the text, a primordial chaos goddess, and his subsequent organization of the cosmos and assignment of duties to the other gods. Sitchin interpreted divine family trees are complicated. She was a force of nature, goddess of love and war, incredibly ambitious, and not this as a historical account of Marduk's gradual and often forceful ascent to power among the Anunnaki, afraid to use her charms or her weapons to get what she wanted. Sitchin portrayed her as constantly maneuvering for more on Earth. He saw it as Marduk challenging the established order, particularly the authority of Enlil and his clan. As power, more territory, more worship. She famously tried to usurp power from Enki by getting him drunk and tricking him into giving. Sitchin's narrative paints a picture of Earth being divided into different regions or domains, each controlled by a particular Anunnaki or some of his precious emis, those divine powers/technologies. She also had legendary conflicts with her sister deity and their followers. Mesopotamia was, of course, central, but Egypt was often seen as Enki's Territoriarish-Kygel, queen of the underworld, and with other gods who stood in her way. You can imagine that he was sometimes equated with the Egyptian god Ptah, while other regions were assigned to different gods. These territorial divisions often led to Anunnaki council meetings. Oh, here comes Inanna. Lock up the MEs and hide the good silver disputes. Imagine divine turf wars, but with much higher stakes than your average street gang. This river valley ain't big. These divine squabbles weren't just happening in some ethereal realm. According to Sitchin, they played enough for the two of us. Ninurta. One of the most significant conflicts Sitchin describes is what he terms the out on Earth, with human armies often conscripted to fight on behalf of their patron deities. Cities aligned with particular pyramid wars. He proposed that these weren't just isolated skirmishes, but a series of major conflicts between the Anunnaki gods would go to war with cities aligned with rival gods. The Pyramid Wars, a term Sitchin Yzedlalite and Inkaite factions, fought primarily over control of the Sinai Peninsula spaceport and the Giza complex, which he viewed as to describe conflicts in Egypt and the Sinai Peninsula, were, in his view, battles between different Anunnaki factions for control of space vital navigational and technological installations. He interpreted certain Egyptian and Mesopotamian texts, including lamentation texts that describe cities being destroyed and ports, mining facilities, or other key installations. He interpreted certain obscure texts as accounts of these wars, describing the use of terrifying gods warring with each other as evidence of these devastating battles. He even suggested that the destruction of Sumerian civilization around two weapons of brilliance and pulverizing rays. It a mainstream historical fact that ancient Mesopotamian city 000 BCE, often attributed by mainstream historians to factors like salinization of the land, internal strife, and invasion states frequently warred with each other, often invoking their patron deities for support and justification. Scholars see these as human by groups like the Amorites and Elamites, was actually the result of a catastrophic nuclear event, the use of conflicts driven by a desire for resources, territory, and political dominance, with religion playing an ideological role. Sitchin, 7 terrifying weapons by Ninurta and another god, Nergal, to destroy the rebellious cities allied with Marduk, naturally flipped this, suggesting the humans were often just pawns in larger Anunnaki conflicts. Here's including, tragically, their own spaceport in Sinai to deny it to him. The resulting radioactive fallout, Sitchin claimed quirky tidbit. The Giza pyramids, particularly the second pyramid, Khafre's, were supposedly at the center of one, then drifted over Sumer, poisoning the land and leading to its demise. It a mainstream historical fact that the such major Anunnaki conflict, involving factions led by Marduk, whom Sitchin identified with the Egyptian god Re, and of the Sumerian Ur-3 dynasty around 2004 BCE, was a period of great upheaval, marked by invasions and collapse of central authority, leading to a dark age before the rise of Babylon. Sitchin's nuclear and those loyal to Enlil. The damage to the Sphinx, particularly its nose, has even been attributed by some fringe war explanation is, needless to say, far outside the mainstream consensus. Here's a quirky tidbit. In the theorists, not to Napoleon's troops or gradual erosion, but to ancient Anunnaki weaponry during these very conflicts. Sumerian myth Lugali, or the exploits of Ninurta, the warrior god Ninurta battles take that, you nosy Sphinx. One can almost hear a frustrated warrior god exclaim. These cosmic feuds had a monstrous bird demon called Enzu, or Imdigud, who has stolen the Tablet of Destinies from devastating consequences for humanity. Entire cities could be laid waste, populations decimated, all because of a power struggle between beings humans and Lil. Ninurta eventually defeats Enzu and recovers the tablet. While mainstream scholars see this as a mythological combat story worshipped as gods. The biblical story of the Tower of Babel, where humanity tries to build a tower to reach the heavens, Sitchin interpreted Enzu not as a demon, but perhaps as a rebellious Anunnaki commander or even a rival alien, and God confuses their languages, is seen by Sitchin not as a punishment for human hubris, but as a deliberate group, and the Tablet of Destinies as a crucial piece of advanced technology, making this a battle over control of act by the Anunnaki, specifically Enlil, in his telling, scatter humanity and prevent them from uniting, superweapon or a command module. It's like an ancient cosmic action movie. These divine feuds were perhaps because a united human front might have become too powerful or aligned with a rival Anunnaki faction. The confounding of languages was a just fought with advanced weaponry. They involved political maneuvering, alliances, betrayals, and propaganda, much like human conflicts. The gods' strategic move to divide and conquer. Historians still argue whether the intense rivalries and battles described among the gods and mythologies worldwide primarily reflect internal societal conflicts and anxieties within the human cultures that created them, or if they could be echoes of more would try to sway human populations to their side, leading to human armies fighting as proxies for their divine patrons. So, when you read about ancient wars between Sumerian city-states or between different kingdoms in the Near East, Sitchin might ancient external power struggles. This is where myth and potential prehistory blur. The Anunnaki, it seems, brought suggest that behind these human conflicts lay the guiding and often manipulative hands of their Anunnaki overlords, settling their baggage with them from Nibiru, their ambitions, their jealousies, their ancient grudges. Earth became a new arena of their own scores. Historians still argue whether the frequent warfare between ancient Mesopotamian city-states was primarily driven by competition for these old conflicts. The quest for gold, the management of their human workforce, the allocation of territories, all became for resources like water and arable land, dynastic ambitions, or if ideological and religious factors played a more significant role than fuel for their internal disputes. You could almost see Earth as a divine corporation with different departments, led by Enlil, Enki, and Nana, etc., constantly vying for budget, resources, and the CEOs. Anu's previously understood. The picture that emerges is one of a deeply dysfunctional divine family whose internal power struggles repeatedly spilled over into the human realm, causing immense suffering and shaping the course of early human history. It suggests that our ancestors were not just passive favor, sometimes resorting to hostile takeovers and industrial espionage, but with much more collateral damage. These ongoing Fey observers or servants, but also pawns in these cosmic games of thrones. The rise and fall of empires, the destructionids and the wars they spawned would ultimately play a role, Sitchin argued. In the Anunnaki's eventual decision of cities, the shifting allegiances, all could be seen as reflections of the ongoing feuds among the Anunnaki to largely withdraw from direct overt rule on Earth. The infighting was becoming too destructive, perhaps even threatening their home world Nibiru if key resources or information were lost. The constant battles were a drain on their resources and a distraction from their primary mission. It paints a rather grim picture of our supposed creators, powerful, brilliant, but also petty, jealous, and dangerously prone to violent conflict resolution. It makes you wonder if the image in which they created us included not just the golden age of direct divine rule, if it ever truly existed, was perhaps tarnished by the very human-like failings of these alien gods. Their cosmic soap opera, filled with intrigue and betrayal, had very real and often tragic consequences for physical form, but also our unfortunate capacity for self-destruction and endless squabbling. Perhaps the apple, or in this case, the genetically engineered human, doesn't fall far from the Nibiruan tree. The celestial boardroom was in disarray. The Pyramid Wars had left scars on the landscape, and perhaps on the Anunnaki psyche. Marduk was on the ascendant in Babylon, challenging the old guard. The alleged use of devastating superweapons had, according to Sitchin, rendered parts of the Near East, including their own Sinai spaceport and the land of Sumer itself, dangerously toxic. The gold was still flowing, but the cost, in terms of internal conflict and perhaps even risk to their own long-term survival on Earth, was becoming too high. It seems that even for near-immortal beings from another planet, there comes a point when you just want to pack up your advanced gadgets and go home, or at least take a very, very long vacation. Sitchin's narrative suggests that around the turn of the second millennium BCE, coinciding with the collapse of the Sumerian civilization and the rise of Babylon under Hammurabi, who was a devotee of Marduk, a major shift occurred in Anunnaki policy. Anu, the big boss on Nibiru, perhaps looking at the quarterly reports of infighting, collateral damage, and plummeting human morale, decided that a change in management style was needed. The era of direct, overt Anunnaki rule on Earth was coming to an end. It wasn't necessarily a sudden, dramatic departure, like a fleet of UFOs blasting off in unison, leaving bewildered humans waving goodbye from the ziggurat tops. It was more of a gradual withdrawal, a strategic retreat from the front line to human affairs. The reasons for this departure, or rather this shift to a more hands-off approach, were likely complex. The internal feuding, as we've discussed, was a major factor. It was destructive, counterproductive, and perhaps even threatening to expose their operations or advanced technologies in ways they didn't intend. Remember the Tower of Babel story? Enlil's alleged decision to scatter humanity and confuse their languages was, in Sitchin's view, a move to prevent them from uniting and potentially challenging Anunnaki authority, or becoming too powerful a pawn for one faction against another. The constant warfare was simply unsustainable. Moreover, humanity itself was changing. They had multiplied, spread across the globe, and developed their own distinct cultures and civilizations, albeit often under the initial tutelage of their divine overlords. Perhaps the Anunnaki felt their primitive workers had matured enough or become troublesome enough to be largely left to their own devices, with a system of local kings and priests in place to maintain a semblance of order and ensure the continued, if less direct, flow of resources and reverence. The day-to-day micromanagement was becoming too much hassle. It's like when your startup project finally gets big enough that you can hire middle managers and step back from personally overseeing every single detail. You guys got this, right? Just make sure the gold shipments are on time. And try not to start any more apocalyptic wars, okay? So Sitchin proposes the principal Anunnaki leaders, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, and others gradually began to withdraw from direct involvement. They might have returned to Nibiru during one of its passages, or perhaps retreated to more remote, hidden bases on Earth, or even established permanent orbital stations, content to observe and occasionally intervene covertly rather than rule overtly. Their physical presence became less visible, their voices less directly heard in the royal courts and temples. The gods started to become more mythical, more distant, their stories passed down through generations, slowly morphing from lived experience, for some, into religious belief and legend. But they didn't just vanish without a trace, leaving humanity to completely forget them. They left behind a powerful legacy. Firstly, there was the system of kingship and priesthood, which continued to operate, often claiming divine mandate and preserving the rituals and knowledge, or fragments thereof, that the Anunnaki had imparted. Temples were still dedicated to them, sacrifices still made, their names still invoked in prayers and incantations. The organizational structures they had established persisted, forming the basis for many subsequent civilizations. Secondly, and perhaps more controversially in Sitchin's view, they left behind their bloodlines. The demigod heroes, the divinely appointed kings, their descendants, these lineages, Sitchin argued, carry the Anunnaki genetic heritage. He suggested that certain royal families, secret societies, and elite groups throughout history may have consciously or unconsciously preserved this divine bloodline, believing themselves to be special, different, perhaps even destined to rule. This idea of a hidden Anunnaki bloodline continuing to influence human affairs from behind the scenes is a potent one in many modern conspiracy theories that draw on Sitchin's work. It's a mainstream historical fact that many ancient royal families, from Egypt to Rome to later European monarchies, claim divine descent or special favor from the gods to legitimize their rule. Sitchin simply took this a step further, suggesting a literal genetic basis for these claims, originating with extraterrestrial ancestors. Here's a quirky tidbit. The concept of the Shem-Suhor or followers of Horus in ancient Egyptian lore is sometimes cited by alternative theorists as evidence of an elite group that preserved ancient knowledge and possibly Anunnaki lineage, guiding Egyptian civilization from its earliest days. Mainstream Egyptology interprets them differently, of course, often as semi-mythical ancestors or priestly groups. The departure also meant that their advanced technologies were largely withdrawn or fell into disuse and disrepair, becoming the lost arts or secrets of the gods that later cultures would marvel at or try to rediscover. Those landing platforms and power stations might have crumbled or been repurposed, their true function forgotten, becoming enigmatic ruins that puzzle archaeologists today. The MEs, those tablets of divine power, were hidden away or lost, their knowledge becoming fragmented and mythologized. Historians still argue whether the decline of certain ancient civilizations, like the Sumerians or the Indus Valley Civilization, can be attributed solely to environmental factors and internal socio-political dynamics, or if there were other, perhaps more abrupt or external, contributing causes that are not yet fully understood. While mainstream history points to well-documented factors like climate change, invasions, and resource depletion, the allure of a more dramatic, lost wisdom explanation persists in some circles. So the Anunnaki largely packed their bags or powered down their earthly avatars. But their echoes remained. In the stones of ancient cities, in the words of sacred texts, in the blood of kings, and in the enduring human fascination with those who from heaven to earth came. Their departure wasn't an ending, but a transition. Humanity was now, for the most part on its own, left to navigate its destiny, armed with the tools, the knowledge, and the often conflicting impulses instilled by its departed, or at least more distant creators. The stage was set for human history to unfold, but always with the lingering question, are they truly gone, or are they still watching from afar, perhaps waiting for the right moment to return? The silence they left behind was, in some ways, as profound as their thunderous arrival. The great Anunnaki starships, or so the story goes, had largely departed, or at least dimmed their celestial headlights, leaving humanity to stumble forward into its own future. The divine micromanagement era was over. But you know how it is with really good stories. They don't just end. They morph, they adapt, they get retold, and sometimes they resurface in surprisingly modern disguises. The Anunnaki narrative, with its potent blend of ancient myth and extraterrestrial intervention, didn't just fade into academic obscurity with the last cuneiform tablet. Oh no, it found fertile new ground in the 20th and 21st centuries, blossoming in the vibrant, if sometimes bewildering, garden of modern ufology and alien encounter beliefs. It's almost as if the human psyche, having been told for millennia that powerful beings came from the sky and shaped our destiny, couldn't quite shake the habit of looking upwards for answers or for intervention. When the gods of old became too distant, too mythological, new sky beings started to appear, no longer in fiery chariots or winged discs explicitly named in ancient texts, but in sleek, silent UFOs, in tales of alien abductions, and in theories of ongoing extraterrestrial engagement with Earth. Zecharias Sitchin's work in the 1970s was a crucial bridge. He took those ancient Sumerian deities and essentially gave them a science fiction makeover, rebranding them as astronauts from Planet X. This resonated powerfully with a public already primed by decades of UFO sightings, from Kenneth Arnold's flying saucers in 1947 to the Roswell incident and the burgeoning contact team movement of the 1950s, where individuals claimed to be in communication with benevolent and often very human-looking space brothers from Venus or other nearby planets. Sitchin provided a historical anchor, a kind of ancient pedigree, for these modern alien encounters. It wasn't just random visitors. It was potentially the same visitors or their descendants still keeping an eye on the grand experiment. You start to see the Anunnaki narrative weaving its way into various threads of contemporary alien lore. The idea of different alien races with different agendas, some benevolent, some neutral, some hostile, echoes the complex pantheon of Anunnaki gods with their conflicting personalities and goals. Enki, the compassionate creator, might be seen as a precursor to the friendly Pleiadians or Arcturians of modern channeling, while the stern, judgmental Enlil could find his modern counterpart in theories of manipulative reptilians or cold, calculating grays. It's a mainstream historical fact that belief in UFOs and extraterrestrial visitation is a widespread global phenomenon, with polls consistently showing a significant percentage of the population in many countries believing that aliens have visited Earth or are currently present. The Anunnaki story offers a kind of historical validation for these beliefs, suggesting this isn't a new phenomenon but a very, very old one. The concept of genetic engineering, so central to Sitchin's interpretation of Adamu's creation, finds its modern echo in alien abduction narratives, where abductees often report undergoing medical examinations, having genetic material extracted, or even being involved in alien-human hybridization programs. If the Anunnaki created us by mixing their genes with early hominids, perhaps their descendants or other interested alien species are still tinkering with our DNA, continuing the great cosmic experiment, or trying to create a new generation of hybrids for reasons unknown. It's a chilling thought, lying there in the dark, isn't it? That our very biology might still be an active project for someone else. Then there's the theme of a coming return. Just as many religions predict the return of a messiah or a savior figure, many in the UFO community anticipate a disclosure event where governments finally admit the truth about alien presence or even a mass landing, a second coming of a more extraterrestrial nature. Sitchin's Nibiru, with its 3,600-year orbit, inherently contains the idea of periodic returns. While Sitchin himself never predicted a specific doomsday date for Nibiru's reappearance, contrary to many internet prophecies that latched onto his work, the very concept of this giant home planet periodically re-entering our solar system keeps alive the possibility of the Anunnaki one day coming back in force. What would that look like? Would they be pleased with how we've managed the planet in their absence? Given our track record, that meeting might be a little awkward. So, about those instructions we left regarding peace, harmony, and not blowing things up, you didn't happen to lose that memo, did you? Here's a quirky tidbit. Many New Age belief systems incorporate elements of the Anunnaki story, often blending it with concepts from theosophy, spiritualism, and channeled information, creating elaborate cosmic histories where the Anunnaki play a role alongside ascended masters, galactic federations, and various other celestial beings. It's like a giant shared universe fan fiction, but with the fate of humanity at stake. The idea of ancient advanced technology left behind by the Anunnaki also fuels modern treasure hunts and conspiracy theories. Are governments secretly reverse engineering crashed UFOs? Perhaps Anunnaki scout ships that got a bit lost? Are powerful, hidden technologies like free energy devices or anti-gravity being suppressed because they would overturn the existing world order? These ideas often tie back to the notion that the Anunnaki possess such technologies and either left some behind or might bring them back. Historians still argue whether the persistence of ancient astronaut theories, despite strong academic skepticism, reflects a genuine inadequacy in conventional historical explanations for certain ancient mysteries, a deep-seated human psychological need for grander origin stories, or simply the appeal of compelling narratives in an information-saturated age. It's likely a combination of all these factors. So as you lie there on the cusp of sleep, consider how these ancient whispers from Sumer have found new voices in our modern world. The names might have changed, the spaceships might look a bit sleeker, but the core idea that we are not alone, that powerful beings from beyond our world have shaped our past and may yet shape our future, remains incredibly potent. The Anunnaki, whether real extraterrestrial visitors or powerful archetypes from our collective unconscious, continue to cast a long shadow, inviting us to question not just where we came from, but also where we might be going and who else might be along for the ride. The ancient roots of our modern alien mythos run deep, right back to that Fertile Crescent, under those star-choked Mesopotamian skies. Now, after that rather exhilarating gallop through millennia of alleged alien intervention, from gold mining gods to modern UFOs, it's probably a good time to gently tap the brakes and acknowledge the rather large, academically robed elephant in the room. While Zecharias Sitchin's theories about the Anunnaki and Nibiru have undeniably captivated millions and spawned a whole subgenre of ancient astronaut literature, it's crucial to understand that his interpretations are, to put it mildly, not accepted by the overwhelming majority of mainstream historians, archaeologists, linguists, and scholars specializing in ancient Near Eastern studies. In fact, not accepted is perhaps too gentle. Words like dismissed, debunked, or even ridiculed are often used in academic circles when discussing Sitchin's specific claims. So, why the deep skepticism? It's not just a case of stuffy academics refusing to consider new ideas. The criticisms are quite specific and strike at the very foundations of Sitchin's work, primarily his translation and interpretation of Sumerian cuneiform texts. Remember those clay tablets we talked about, the primary source material for all this? Well, professional cuneiformists, scholars who have dedicated their lives to the painstaking study of these ancient languages, argue that Sitchin made fundamental errors in his translations. They contend that he often took words out of context, assigned them meanings they didn't have in Sumerian or Akkadian, or strung together unrelated syllables to create new words that fit his preconceived theories. For example, Sitchin's crucial translation of the Sumerian word Shem, or Mu in some contexts as skychamber or rocket ship, is a major point of contention. Mainstream scholars assert that Shem typically means name, renown, monument, or lineage, depending on the context. The idea that it refers to a physical spacecraft is, according to them, entirely Sitchin's invention, not supported by the linguistic evidence. Similarly, his identification of Nibiru as a specific, yet-to-be-discovered 12th planet in a 3,600-year orbit is based on interpretations of astronomical texts that other scholars read very differently, often seeing them as references to Jupiter, Mars, or mythological celestial bodies, not a literal rogue planet populated by astronauts. It's a mainstream historical fact that no recognized cuneiform scholar supports Sitchin's translations or his overarching Anunnaki astronaut narrative based on those translations. This is a significant point. The very people best qualified to read the original text do not agree with what Sitchin claimed they said. Then there's the issue of iconography. Those winged discs and horn crowns? Mainstream art historians and archaeologists interpret these within the rich symbolic vocabulary of ancient Mesopotamian art. Winged discs are widely understood as symbols of the sun god, Shamash/Utu, or of supreme divinity and kingship. Horn crowns are a standard way of depicting deities, the number of horns often indicating their rank in the pantheon. To see them as literal depictions of spacecraft or astronaut helmets is, from the academic perspective, to ignore centuries of scholarship on Mesopotamian art and religious symbolism. It's like looking at a Christian painting of an angel with wings and insisting it's a literal depiction of an alien with a feathered jetpack. Furthermore, critics point out that Sitchin often engaged in what they call parallelomania, drawing connections between disparate myths, symbols, or archaeological sites from different cultures and time periods, assuming a common origin, i.e. the Anunnaki, without sufficient evidence of direct historical linkage. The fact that many cultures have flood myths, for instance, doesn't automatically mean they all refer to a single Anunnaki-caused global flood. Anthropologists and folklorists point to common human experiences like devastating local floods and universal psychological archetypes as more plausible explanations for such recurring themes. Here's a quirky tidbit. One common criticism leveled against Sitchin and other ancient astronaut theorists is that they often underestimate the ingenuity and capabilities of ancient peoples. The argument goes that by attributing achievements like megalithic construction or advanced astronomical knowledge to aliens, these theories inadvertently, or sometimes explicitly, diminish the accomplishments of our human ancestors, who were perfectly capable of remarkable feats of engineering, observation, and social organization using the tools and knowledge available to them. It's a sort of ancient human erasure, some critics might say. Academics also point to the lack of corroborating physical evidence. If the Anunnaki were here for hundreds of thousands of years, running massive mining operations, building spaceports, and engaging in high-tech warfare, where is the unambiguous archaeological evidence? Where are the crashed rocket parts, the discarded alien power tools, the radiation signatures from ancient nuclear explosions, beyond Sitchin's interpretation of desert glass or Dead Sea saltiness? While Sitchin argued that such evidence exists but is misinterpreted or suppressed, mainstream science operates on the principle that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and that evidence, they say, is simply not there in the archaeological record. Historians still argue whether the burden of proof for extraordinary historical claims rests solely on those making the claims, or if mainstream academia has a responsibility to more actively engage with and investigate fringe theories, even if only to definitively refute them. This is a broader debate about the boundaries of legitimate scholarly inquiry and the public understanding of science and history. It's also worth noting that Sitchin was largely an independent researcher, not affiliated with a university or major research institution in the field of Near Eastern studies. While this doesn't automatically invalidate his work, many groundbreaking discoveries have come from outside established institutions. It did mean his theories weren't subject to the same rigorous peer review process that academic research typically undergoes before publication. Peer review, while not infallible, is designed to catch errors, challenge assumptions, and ensure a certain level of scholarly rigor. So, what does this mean for our sleepy journey into the Anunnaki saga? It means that the story, as compelling and fascinating as it is, especially when woven together by a skilled narrator like Sitchin, exists largely outside the framework of accepted academic history and archaeology. It's a powerful modern myth, a speculative reinterpretation of ancient myths, rather than a documented historical account according to the standards of mainstream scholarship. Does this make it less interesting to ponder as you drift off to sleep? Not necessarily. But it's important to have that context to understand that the story of Anunnaki alien gods from Nibiru is a captivating, what-if, a fringe exploration, rather than a chapter from your standard history textbook. The dreamscape is, after all, a place where all possibilities can be explored, but it's good to know where the academic signposts are pointing when you wake up, though. We've journeyed from the sun-baked plains of ancient Sumer through the labyrinthine theories of Zecharias Sitchin, explored alleged alien technologies, cosmic feuds, and the enduring echoes of these Anunnaki in modern UFO lore. And we've also acknowledged the rather firm pushback from the halls of academia, where Sitchin's narrative is largely seen as a fascinating work of speculative fiction rather than historical fact. As the night deepens and your eyelids grow heavier, it's perhaps a good moment to reflect on why this story, regardless of its scholarly standing, holds such a persistent and powerful appeal for so many. What is it about these tales of alien gods from Nibiru that captures the imagination and keeps us looking up at the stars, wondering? At its heart, the Anunnaki story taps into some of humanity's most fundamental questions. Where do we come from? Why are we here? Are we alone in the universe? These are the grand existential queries that have haunted philosophers, theologians, and ordinary people staring into campfires for millennia. Conventional science offers answers rooted in evolution, natural selection, and the vast impersonal processes of the cosmos. Religion offers answers based on faith, divine creation, and sacred texts. The Anunnaki narrative, however, offers a third way, a kind of mythic science fiction that blends elements of both, proposing a creation story that is both divinely orchestrated by godlike beings and technologically plausible within a science fiction framework. It gives us creators who are not distant and ethereal, but tangible, flawed, and relatable, almost like a superpowered, dysfunctional family who just happened to build a planet and genetically engineer a species on the side. There's an undeniable allure to the idea that our origins are more extraordinary than we've been told. That humanity is not just an accidental byproduct of cosmic chemistry on a random planet, but a deliberate creation, a special project of beings far older and wiser, or at least more technologically advanced than ourselves. It imbues human history with a sense of grand drama, a cosmic significance. We're not just living out our own small stories. We're part of an interstellar saga, a chapter in the chronicles of Nibiru. This can be a comforting thought, in a strange way. It suggests purpose, even if that original purpose was merely to dig gold. I may be stuck in traffic, you might think, but my ancestors were personally engineered by space gods. It adds a certain je ne sais quoi to the daily grind. The story also offers explanations for mysteries that mainstream science or history haven't fully resolved to everyone's satisfaction. Those enigmatic megalithic structures like Baalbek or Pumapunku, alien power tools, the sudden sophistication of Sumerian civilization, Anunnaki tutelage, the ubiquity of flood myths, a deliberate Anunnaki culling. It's a grand unified theory of weirdness, tying together disparate anomalies into a single overarching narrative. For those who feel that conventional explanations are lacking or too mundane, the Anunnaki provide a far more exciting and seemingly comprehensive answer. It's a mainstream historical fact that periods of rapid cultural or technological change in history, often called efflorescences or golden ages, do sometimes appear quite suddenly in the archaeological record, prompting much scholarly debate about their causes and catalysts. While mainstream explanations focus on combinations of environmental factors, social dynamics, and human innovation, the mystery of these bursts of creativity provides fertile ground for alternative theories. Moreover, the Anunnaki narrative often carries an implicit critique of established authority and conventional wisdom. It suggests that the governments, the scientific establishment, the mainstream media are not telling us the full story, that there's a hidden history, a suppressed truth. This appeals to a natural human skepticism and a desire to uncover secrets, to be in the know. In an age of information overload and widespread distrust of institutions, a narrative that claims to reveal the real story can be incredibly seductive. Here's a quirky tidbit. The idea of a cosmic cover-up is a recurring motif in many fringe theories, suggesting that powerful elites are hiding evidence of alien contact or ancient supercivilizations to maintain their control. It adds a layer of conspiratorial intrigue to the already fascinating tale. And let's be honest, there's a sheer entertainment value to it all. Space battles, genetic engineering, feuding gods, hidden planets. It's got all the hallmarks of a great epic. It's mythology for the space age, a story that speaks to our modern fascination with technology and extraterrestrial life, while also connecting us to the deepest roots of human civilization. It allows us to reimagine our past as something far more dynamic and adventurous than dusty history books might suggest. Historians still argue whether the primary function of myth in human society is to explain the natural world, to validate social structures, to provide moral guidance, or to simply entertain and inspire all. The Anunnaki story, in its modern form, seems to try and do all of these things, offering a comprehensive, if unconventional, worldview. So, as we wind down our journey tonight, it doesn't really matter whether you believe every word of Sitchin's translations, or if you view the Anunnaki as purely metaphorical figures representing the forces of nature or aspects of the human psyche. The power of the story lies in its ability to make us wonder, to question, to look at the ancient world with fresh eyes, and to consider the possibility that our place in the cosmos might be far stranger and more interconnected than we currently comprehend. It's a reminder that humanity has always been and continues to be on a cosmic quest for meaning, for connection, and for understanding our own extraordinary and sometimes bewildering existence. The Anunnaki, real or imagined, are a vibrant thread in that ongoing human tapestry of myth, belief, and the eternal search for who we are. And so, dear listener, as the last whispers of Sumerian gods and Nibiruan orbits fade into the quiet hum of your room, allow yourself to drift. The vast starlit deserts of Mesopotamia, the shadowy halls of power where Enlil and Enki once debated the fate of humankind, the colossal stones of Baalbek and Puma Punku, all now recede into the soft landscape of your impending sleep. Whether these tales are literal truths, elaborate metaphors, or simply the echoes of our own deep-seated desires for a grander narrative, they have served their purpose tonight, to carry you to the threshold of dreams. The mysteries of our ancient past, like the stars themselves, remain distant, beautiful, and open to endless interpretation. Perhaps tomorrow you'll seek out more conventional histories, or perhaps you'll find yourself gazing at an old stone wall and wondering what secrets it might whisper if only you knew how to listen like Utnapishtim. For now, though, let all the questions rest. Let the debates of scholars and the pronouncements of prophets dissolve into the gentle rhythm of your breathing. The cosmic feuds have quieted, the celestial chariots are parked, and even the most diligent Anunnaki gold miners have surely clocked off for the night. There is only the stillness, the comfort of your bed, and the promise of restorative slumber. Feel the weight of the day lifting, replaced by a sense of peace, a quiet curiosity that can be picked up again in the morning light, or perhaps in another nighttime journey we might take together. Until then, sleep deeply. Sleep well. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye and see you again in the next stories.